Hello people, Chris VK3AML again, wishing you a very good Christmas season for what's coming up. I'm recording this at 9:30 PM on the 4th of December 2021. Tonight's transmission will be fairly contentious, and I hope we don't run into copyright or other political issues, because I'll be tackling the subject of climate change, which I know is anathema to some, but having been face to face with it on the glaciers of New Zealand, I think it's worthwhile raising, particularly as we got quite a bit of footage of all of that. I see we're getting some drop frames at this point. I'll just check my streaming on YouTube. May not bode well. Let's see, it seems to be firing up. Okay, good. Well, it being 9:30, as per usual, I'll open up the 147.475 and go on the air. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Transmitting a test transmission on 147.475 FM, and concurrently we're radiating a YouTube video live stream, which you can find if you Google VK3AML for December 2021. That's Google VK3AML for December 2021. This series of transmissions was started as a kind of a ham radio tradition, I suppose you'd call it, by the late Tony Sanderson, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, who frequently ran crossbands between 160 metres and VHF in the 1970s. The role on Saturday nights was taken over by Dave, VK3ASE, during the 1980s, 90s and the first couple of decades of this century, and Dave now has decided that he'd like to have his Saturday nights back, not surprisingly. So, under these circumstances and with the development of the new technology of YouTube live streaming, being a bit of a video shooting enthusiast, I thought it would be a good idea to fill in at this point for Dave. So again, if you want to look in, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima for December 2021. Put that phrase into Google, that'll take you to the live stream. Tonight, a subject that's both interesting and perhaps a little contentious. In 2017, Mike Groth VK7MJ and I, along with my wife Prue and three of Prue's nursing colleagues, did a tour of New Zealand in which we toured the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand, starting at Haast in the south, moving north through the Fox and Franz Josef glaciers. And we went to the terminal moraines, the bottom part of the glaciers, both at Fox and Franz Josef. And Mike, who had been there 11 years previously, I think it was shocked by the way these glaciers had receded. They'd gone back, melted basically. And that can only be in response to one thing, and that is climate change. Now, you'll hear nothing of politicians, shock jocks, or anything political in tonight's transmission. You will hear interviews that I did with several scientists working at the National Institute of Water and Air, that is New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Air, NIWA, their atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder, in a remote part of Central Otago in the South Island of New Zealand. There they measure the amount of atmospheric ozone, the height of the ozone layer, and the state of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and others. So I thought tonight the visit to the glaciers, combined later on with a visit to the atmospheric monitoring site at Lauder in New Zealand, would be two subjects that sit well together. We visited Lauder in 2019, 2 years after seeing the glaciers. So what starts out in the video you're about to see as a simple travelling video, a tourist video up the west coast of the South Island, turns into something a bit more serious, an investigation into the disappearance of the New Zealand glaciers and an investigation as to why. You won't hear from Bob Brown, you won't hear from Alan Jones, you won't hear from Andrew Bolt or from Richard Flanagan or any of the other political players in this climate change thing. You'll purely hear the views of the scientists who are measuring it. So please, this is not a political transmission, this is purely reportage. Okay, let's take you to the video. New Zealand's southern westland, Fox, Franz Josef and glacial retreat, measuring atmospheric change at Lauder. Now we started our tour of the west coast at Fox, which you see there on the left there. It's about as far south as you can go on the West Coast Highway. And these are typical scenes.
Did she get too boisterous and get excited?
Coming into Fox.
Of the West Coast forest to the town of Fox, which is just about the southernmost town on the west coast of
we crossed the river.
the South Island.
This is sort of a big wide bit, then it gets narrower again.
If you look out the side, you can see the start of the Alps, and boy, do they go up fast from the coastal plain. Down that way south, there are only a couple of fishing hamlets, maybe 2 or 3 huts in each, on a dirt road, which I think we've just passed, and a few cattle being put out here.
The cattle, and they had a problem with bovine tuberculosis, and the possums carried it. Fishing, gold, setting flights, rafting, jet boating, sex.
Coming into Fox.
Between married couples and unmarried couples.
Just remember that this west coast area has a very high rainfall, and this tends to be reflected in the type of vegetation.
Should have a look at the township.
Don't blink, we'll miss the town.
Hotel and tavern. This way. Marks Road. I don't think the road.
Hast is very small, but a very significant township.
Of the settlements will be staying in the entire. What was the name? The name.
Past what?
Past what? Lodge? Oh, sorry. No.
Nobody knew which motel name we had, and we couldn't find the motel.
Oh,
We need an exact name.
Okay.
that was Hast Lodge.
No, it's not Hast Lodge.
Aspiring Court Motel.
Here we go.
Backpackers Wilderness.
Past River Top 10 Holiday Park.
Thank goodness Prue found the name, otherwise we never would have got to our motel. This is in the way into Fox Township, and our motel, our accommodation place was a little bit beyond this.
So this
Heritage
Park.
Park Motel.
We're in Hast, yes.
Oh, there's motel.
Hast Park Lodge.
And this is where we stayed at Fox, on the southern part of the west coast of the South Island. This is about as close to Melbourne across the other side of the Tasman as you can get that's easily accessible. So just after we arrived here, I set up an HF receiver to see what I could hear of late afternoon traffic in Melbourne, this being, I think, a Friday afternoon. All I could hear was an amateur in Bendigo who was abusing a couple of VK7s on 40 metres, so I didn't persist. But this is the nature of the area. It's very remote, very isolated, very high rainfall, which we got a sampling of on the afternoon of our arrival. We were in those little units on the left there.
The last 2 units there.
And there's my HF receiver on the table just after we tried it. After this, we had an impromptu afternoon meal at our motel. Mike is up there doing some videoing. That's north, and it's all shrouded in rain.
It's about 4:45 in the afternoon, and the rain has come in, or light rain. After all, we are the west coast of New Zealand, and they only get about 300 inches of rain a year, and it rains about 250 days a year or something. Milford Sound, I think it's 290 days or something.
And then we had a look around the area when the clouds broke sufficiently for us to take a walk. Most of the tourist venues in this town were for people who like to live on the edge a little. And this is the motel we're staying in at Haast, and it's very nearly the end of the world here. To give you some idea, that's looking up the Haast River Valley where we came in from the east to this west coast of New Zealand. And there's a very thin, peaty, not terribly fertile coastal strip. And then if you look south from here, as we're doing at the moment, the road to Haast's township is there. You can see a series of mountains distantly rolling almost vertically into the sea. That's fjordland down there.
There's another, there's the third. After about the fifth, you'll see Milford Sound. Now what I'd like to point out about that is that all of those mountains, all of that land, uninhabited, impenetrable, massive forests and mountains plunging almost vertically into the sea. Nowhere to hike, no trails.
Well, a few trails that you can hike, but that's only for the hardy.
A fanning delta of glacial melt streams, which are the characteristic grey of glacial melt, greyish blue. So this is as far south on the west coast as we get.
That's the backpackers section of the motel, and every now and then you'd find these Richia, I think they are, pandenifolia, a little bit like the Richia of Tasmania. There were some berries on this tree which I thought were cherries, but I wasn't willing to take the risk. I've come a cropper with that when I was a kid. We then did a trip a little bit south, as far south as we could go conveniently, to Haast Beach over the Haast River, and this is the main highway road over the Haast River to the south, to the last settlement, I suppose you'd call it, Jackson's Bay, that's accessible along this coast. There are a few tracks that go in further, but nothing substantial. One of the local telecommunications buildings, and the local inhabitants, of which there are quite a few. Cute little fellas, aren't they? We're on our way to the beach here. This is Haast Beach Township, what's left of it. And these are the beaches, grey sand, volcanic sand. Beaches were pounded by westerlies inshore, and like most west coast beaches, covered with bits of driftwood. That, I think, is a shark's egg, or pupal case, I'm not quite sure. Oxalis was around, I think that's a bit of a weed. There's that pandenifolia thing, I think, Richia of some kind. Haast Beach Township, this is as far south as you can find a general store, I think. And that road to the south is basically as far as you can go. Then that night we had dinner at the Hard Antler Cafe at Haast, and this obviously is a cafe that services a large area because it had a very large attendance. People subsequently asked me, were they wearing gumboots? Well, you can see, no. I doubt whether the cafe would have allowed that. Life is uncertain, eat dessert first, a good philosophy. That was up on the wall. So We had our first night on the west coast at Haast, watched the sun go down, rather a sublime sunset after the rain that we had. And the next morning we woke to an incredible blue sky, much better weather than we'd actually expected from this rainy part of the world.
Past 7 on Saturday the 28th of January.
We didn't expect that either.
Taken off from the airstrip behind us, going for an early morning joyride. And what a beautiful morning it did. Be lovely flying conditions. Yeah, be lovely flying conditions this morning. Oh, it'd be absolutely perfect conditions for flying. But there's the everything's clear. There's the Southern Alps extending down to the end of New Zealand. Somewhere out there in the distance is Milford Sound.
Fjordland.
Fjordland, yes, it is Fjordland past here, down to all the fjords, all uninhabited, except for, I think, a couple of small things, small settlements that are only reachable by boat. And there's the Haast Pass we've just come through, and the sun is just behind the mountain, so I can actually still get a shot. It's probably only about 6 o'clock. Local solar time, because New Zealand has about, over the west coast, they've got about half an hour of permanent daylight saving anyway. So it's probably about 6 o'clock mean solar time.
And then we went north over these single lane bridges. They have a passing arrangement in the middle, usually like that.
Pahui River. Oh, look at that. That was quite pleasant.
This west coast road is cut through incredibly verdant.
This is the coast north of Haast, and as you can see, the beaches here are kind of a dirty grey colour, obviously volcanic, and as I'm filming this I'm being bitten by sandflies rather badly. But a lot of this coast is uninhabited and in fact has no agricultural activity whatever. The thing that you notice about the west coast of New Zealand is that the coast is littered with these stumps and bits of dross. If you look there, for example, there's a very prominent stump just sticking out of the beach. There's so much rain here that the fast-flowing streams take all sorts of rubbish down from the surrounding forests, and then the onshore currents of the ocean throw the stuff up on the beach.
On the west coast, and considering it gets about 400 inches of rain a year, it's a really good day. This is a spot where there's a pull-off right next to the ocean, and a van and a tent up there, I think, selling hot drinks and teas and coffees and all the rest of it, and ice creams and all the rest of the things you buy. The sandflies are out. Someone on a nice long motorcycle ride. There we are, coffee and pulled pork focaccias, I think, or breccia or something, I don't know. Something exotic. Yeah, looking down the road to Haast.
Then up over the Karangaroo River with its suspension bridge. This again is typical of West Coast road bridges in this part of New Zealand. They're only one way. You have to watch for cars approaching from the other side. There's certainly no passing on them. And as we moved north, we were getting to the higher country inland, getting very close to Mount Cook, the highest mountain in New Zealand. And there is Mount Cook poking its head over the top of the rainforest-covered lower mountains. Now, there are 3 major glaciers near Mount Cook. The one on the eastern side of the range, which we didn't see, is the Tasman Glacier, the longest one. Then north, Franz Josef, and in the south, the Fox Glacier, both of the latter two opening to the west coast. Here's a view of Mount Cook that I took from the plane in, and I'll mark for you those two glaciers so you can see them on this aerial view. There's the Fox Glacier in the south, the Franz Josef in the north, both on very steep slopes. And you can get a bit of the Tasman on the left, on the other side of the range. We didn't see the Tasman. First of all, let's look at the Fox Glacier there. There is a valley walk that you could take, that we did take, so we drove in off the main road to have a look and went through this incredible verdant country.
On the south side, and as you can see, the trees are arching over us at the top. We are swallowed by rainforest. The trees and the tree ferns, I might add.
And here's a close shot of some of the sphagnum and ferns that constitute the rainforest in this part of the world. Incredibly tall tree ferns too.
Fox Glacier. We're on the south side, looking up the valley.
As in about a metre a year. This is something we don't have in Australia, these sort of glaciers. And unfortunately, New Zealand may be in the same position within the next few decades. We're driving into the Fox Glacier car park, and notice this glacial till.
Downstream from the Fox Glacier, this is glacial meltwater. And if you look up in the cliffs there, you can actually see the scour marks where the glacier has been, at right angles to those rock marks. Swinging around to the peaks here, which are up near 9,000 feet, rising almost from sea level. There is the glacier, right up there.
And in due course we'd make our way up there. This is VK3AML testing. If you want to look in on the video that we're concurrently running, please Google VK3AML 4 December 2021. That is, Google the phrase VK3AML 4 December 2021, and you should be looking at this, which is a tour of the glaciers of the South Island of New Zealand, and then a visit to the National Institute of Water and Air, NIWA's atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder. And you'll see how these two subjects interconnect very shortly. VK3AML, back to the video.
People are walking down to a path that extends down in the valley there. You can see them walking along to the point where you can actually take a good look at the glacier.
Glacial till mixing with colloidal material.
There we are, there's the sign.
On our way up to the Fox Glacier, there was a constant roar of aeroplanes and helicopters above, taking people up for a view.
This is the lower termination of the Fox Glacier, and it so visibly has shrunk back from where the glacier ended 50 years or even 100 ago, that you would have to be an ostrich with your head in the ground and your nose probably in the air to not realise global warming is responsible for this.
You can imagine that seeing this sort of thing, particularly Mike, at a distance of 11 years or so since his last visit, Seeing the amount of meltback in these does make you somewhat angry for the skeptics. We'll get back to that later. Here's Mike in his red uniform coming up to the terminal moraine to take some footage.
"11 years ago the glacier terminated here. As you can see, it's now completely gone. People used to walk out from that rock onto the glacier. Now it has retreated in the course of 11 years, something like a kilometre or so.
About 200 metres was about as close as we could get, because if the terminal moraine collapses into the water...
At the viewing point, we're probably about 200 metres from the end of the glacier. It's as far as you're allowed to go. And there's the lower level. There's the upper level there. Gosh, you'd reckon it's retreated 500, maybe almost a kilometre in the last 11 years. It's only the rump of the glacier now. Used to be quite magnificent.
The roar of the meltwater was incredible.
This was 11 years ago, it was still full of ice.
This is where you can see the glacier retreating, and what looks like rock there is actually ice melting under the glacier. Only 11 years ago, this valley was entirely full of ice, and the glacier terminated almost 500 metres down. It has retreated an awful lot. And there's another helicopter doing the circuit up there. There are two major faces, that's the upper, that's the lower. Underneath all of that aggregation of gravel is ice. Fox Glacier, New Zealand.
This remarkable time-lapse picture was taken over just 1 year, and you can watch the melt back for the year 2014 to 15, 1 frame per day. Here we go. Notice the ice is melting back to about halfway across the picture there. Frighteningly fast. An interesting point, glaciers don't lie. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima testing. You can see it's melted almost to the left side of the picture now. And that's January 2015. It's got a lot further since then. This is a panoramic shot I took from the viewing point for the terminal moraine. Mike looking quite shocked. He took a look back and shook his head before walking back down towards the car. Quite a steep walk, as you can see. But then this glacier and the Franz Josef glacier are on very steep mountain slopes. There's the meltwater heading down to the west coast. On the right.
That's the sort of colour. If you get a deep water in Christchurch, you get it, or you get any of the water out of the glacial streams. That's the sort of colour it comes out.
Is it?
Tissue, Chris?
No, I'm right.
And that's the very fine colloidal glacial till, the fine rock flour. But this is just ground up rock flour. That white. Weather.
The town of Fox, entirely dependent on tourism, which unfortunately with the melting of the glaciers is tending to decline. The other danger in this area was that this area represents the collision of two tectonic plates, the Pacific plate and the Australasian plate, and it's due for a big earthquake. There's Mount Cook.
Aoraki, the cloud piercer.
Franz Josef Township is surrounded by mountains, more mountains, and the highest one of the lot, Mount Cook, is just down there. This is the main street of Franz Josef, and as you can see, it absolutely, there's a traffic jam here. That's where we had lunch, and up somewhat are the mountains. Mount Cook is in that little division there, and round here behind me,
and I walked down the street to see the local airport, which is dependent on people taking flights up to the Glacier NIWA, the snow catchment area feeding the glacier at the top, and the number of helicopters here was quite overwhelming. Imagine the number of, or the amount of income that this is generating for the local area, an area totally dependent on the existence of the glacier. So I don't think there's any need to inform people here about the consequences of global warming. Fox Franz Josef heli services, refuelling. And a continuous stream of visitors going up to have a look at the glaciers from above. Some of them actually landing at the top of the glacier in these helicopters. This was a particularly good day for it, so that the number of helicopters was just, it was like a swarm of blowflies in the air. Continuous stream of them, impossible to hear the silence of the area because of the continuous roar of visiting helicopters, as you see there. Now leaving Franz Josef, and we're heading for the Franz Josef Glacier this time, which is a bit north of the Fox Glacier. We go through
the Franz Josef Glacier.
and there's the car park for the Franz Josef Glacier, which I took a panoramic shot, and then we went up through some very verdant rainforest country to pick up the path that goes up the glacial stream up through the till.
The Franz Josef Glacier, partly in cloud.
And there were safety precautions due to flooding, icefall, river surges and rockfalls, which can be prominent here. The main walk into the Franz Josef Glacier. Imagine having to hack this out of the rainforest. Continuously damp underfoot. And an incredible catalogue of sphagnum and ferns. This was a relatively dry day. We were surprised. Most of the rest of this filming is by Mike. I decided to forego the long walk up to Franz Josef, so he intrepidly took it on.
Looking down the Franz Josef River valley, this was once all full of ice. Well, certainly was in 1867. Over, coming into view, is a suspension bridge for pedestrians. I think it's still in use. That looks like a couple of people on it. Yeah, there's someone going across it.
Mike having to shout over the noise of the meltwater coming down the glacial till. There's good documentation for all of this as you walk up in various informative posters and whatnot. And a continuous stream of people in summer.
The Franz Josef Glacier, or what's left of it. There's 3 waterfalls coming down there, cascading off the side of the mountain. We're walking along the old glacial, the old bed of the river that from the glacier. This is all retreated. The ice was here about would have been about the 1900s. This would have been full of ice. There's all the helicopters. The place is just alive with helicopters at the moment.
Warnings abound about rock falls and the chance of the terminal moraine collapsing into the water and causing tidal surges in the river. So you keep away from the river and you keep a little bit up.
Oh dear, no wonder we can't drive up to it anymore. The clouds have lifted a bit and you can actually see the glacier coming down the hill. And then it's melting. Gee, it came down a lot further. I think last time I saw it, it was down virtually to the bottom of that V. But this used to be full of ice 100 years ago, this whole valley, looking out to the sea. It's hard to believe that 50 years ago this valley was full of ice. But it is not hard to believe when I see how fast it's going back.
And I'll just interrupt the video at this point to say this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima testing the regular Saturday night test transmission. And if you care to have a look in on this, we're transmitting video of the Fox and Franz Josef Glacier. And later on we'll be visiting the National Institute of Water and Air's atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder in the South Island of New Zealand, which measures atmospheric components, pollutants, particulate matter, and of course greenhouse gases. And you'll see the lasers and the other types of measuring equipment that they use for that. This is VK3AML, back to the Franz Josef Glacier. And you can see the video by Googling VK3AML 4 December 2021. That's VK3 Alpha Mike Lima 4 December 2021.
Ja, aber ja, oder zum Beispiel da.
That's a helicopter that's attempting to land on the upper part of the glacier. It's the only way in and out. And hopefully not dropping into a crevasse. Mike trying to get a steady picture there on maximum zoom. It's not easy. Some of the waterfalls continuously coming off the mountains there. this being a very high rainfall area.
It's the end of the path as far as you can go. But this was all full of ice when I was here 11 years ago. It's, I think, about where the moraine finished. Glacier finished. Gosh, it's changed. And I'll just go up there and have a look. There it is. The cloud occasionally lifts and you can see the ice above it, but there's at least another 1,000 metres above that cloud.
The annual precipitation of snow is 16 metres or more. It's quite an incredible amount, and comes down that very steep slope at 1.5 to 7 metres per day. So the movement is quite rapid, and you'll see that shortly in a time-lapse picture.
There's probably another 2 kilometres above it. I reckon that's about 3,000 feet up, and there's probably another kilometre or 2 kilometres, probably another kilometre or 2 kilometres of ice above that, gradually flowing down the hill. But gee, it's moved back, it's retreated a long way. There's some rain.
Keep your eye on that waterfall. You'll see it forming in this extraordinary time-lapse film made over an 8-year period. There's, down the bottom right there, there's that waterfall just emerging from the bottom of the glacier, and watch as we go through 2013 into 2014 how the terminal moraine is moving up. It's moving back. It's melting back. We're now up to June 2014. February 2015. This was a particularly hot summer, so it moved back a long way here. See, leaping up that hill during that summer. January 2016. And it's melted right back from the bottom of the picture, well back from that waterfall that we saw in Mike's shot, carrying an awful lot of gravel down. As you can imagine, the weight of all of that ice and snow coming down the hill is actually gouging huge amounts of gravel off the side of the mountains. Now 2018, this is courtesy of the Victoria University of Wellington, this extraordinary time-lapse video. And now a video from NIWA on Glaciers Don't Lie. Milford Sound flights.
This year is the worst we've ever seen. There is so much melt over the summer that more than half the glaciers have lost all the snow they gained last winter, plus some from the winter before, and there's rocks sticking out everywhere. The meltback is phenomenal. When I started this game, we had 53 kilometres of ice. That's cubic kilometres, 53. We now have 30% less. And that's in the years, 40 years from 77 to today. 1/3 of it has melted away.
Once these glaciers are gone, we're not going to
Dr. Brian Anderson.
these images again. Like, it's pretty much an archive for the future. And what we're trying to do is take hundreds or even thousands of photos of the glaciers and use it to make these three-dimensional models of the glaciers that we can actually measure really precisely what the glaciers are doing.
A good way to put it is that these are the water towers for the southern part of New Zealand. If we go into a climate in the future where our precipitation changes, that's our storage, that's our bank. And we know that our Southern Alps glaciers are responding quite acutely to what's going on with air temperature and also by association the Tasman Sea sea surface temperature. So this marine heat wave that we've had, that's very bad for the health of the glaciers. The conditions are so changeable, and having expert guidance from the pilot, the conditions on the day to weave us in and out of cloud cover, that's really useful. So we're really grateful to have such an experienced pilot like Andy with us. Yeah, it's an FLIR infrared camera, and we're hopeful that it might tell us something different that the still images cannot tell us. So we'd like to try to capture some of the principal properties of the lakes and the surrounding areas, and even the debris cover over some of our long trunk glaciers like the Tasman.
The glacier is the best climate change indicator you can use. It is everything in the climate that changes the volume of a glacier.
You know, you can say what you want about temperature on the ground, but you can't make a glacier lie. I feel mixed emotions about it in many ways, and we often don't use that term emotion in science, but it is a bit emotional for, you know, if I put myself in Trevor's shoes, he's seen these glaciers during much better years, and they must be like seeing attrition of a child, and for him, because he knows them all intimately. For me, I'm just getting started, and I'm thinking, okay, he's handing the baton off. What's going to happen, and how are we going to feel, you know, when we're his age? You know, will we remember something that, oh, do you remember when there was ice around this place? Or is it going to be a different story with a different ending where we say, okay, we knew we had this problem, we actually did something about it, and look at them coming back. You know, that would be a hope. You know, and I know it's a slim hope at best, but that would be the hope, is that we could do something about that.
And thank you to NIWA for this video. Another video on the photographic documentation of the New Zealand glaciers follows, also made by NIWA.
Tango Kilo Alfred 8,100 feet towards Sarasota.
You want anything around the Olivine Ice Plateau, Drew?
I think the plan was going to snowy. Brian, what do you want to do?
We're aiming to survey more than 50 index glaciers. They've been monitored since the late 1970s with oblique aerial photography, and that marks where the end of the summer snowline lies on each of those glaciers. We're partnering with Victoria University glaciologists for the snowline survey, and our teamwork targets glaciers from a range of sites across the Southern Alps.
This is my 5th year doing this, and in those previous years we've seen the glaciers get smaller every year, and we know that temperatures have just continued to be warmer. 2019 was quite an extreme melt year, so there wasn't much snow on the glacier at all. So hopefully there's a bit more snow on them this year.
Very much from Tommy climbing through.
The Snowline mission captures a portrait of every index glacier in the same way and from the same angle each year. We capture thousands of new digital images during the survey for modeling that can show us how much ice the glacier has lost or how much it's gained.
Overall first impressions is seeing some of the snow and ice covered by the Australian bushfire dust. What we think is happening is basically the lower margin of that dust is marking where the snow line is. Ice below that appears to be clear of any of the dust, and any ice and snow above it is covered, so quite serendipitously marking the end of summer snow line. Andy, can we do like 3 circuits of Brewster? Is that okay?
Yeah.
As we're flying over each glacier, instead of making a pass by it like a flyby, we're flying a loop around it, and we're photographing each glacier around its perimeter, we're able then to put those photographs together to build a three-dimensional model. And Lauren Vargo takes this whole collection of photos that we all shoot from the flight, and she brings it back to Vic Uni to work her magic. Like the level of detail that you're getting.
Yeah, you can see. We're putting all of the photos into this software, and it's pretty simple. It gives us the digital elevation model, so the elevation of the landscape. And when we subtract those from different years, we can get the change in surface elevation, so essentially the volume change. White spots mean not much change. If there was anything that was blue, that would mean that it was gaining in surface elevation or volume. But we can see that it's mostly red, and so the darkest reds are about 12 meters of surface elevation lowering.
To put this into perspective, Brewster has lost 13 billion liters of water in the last 3 years, which is about the average daily drinking water requirement for all New Zealanders. As we move into a changing climate, having a better idea about our water accountancy and therefore knowing a little bit more about this aspect for our water security is important, particularly when we start to consider that things like seasonal droughts might become more severe and or more frequent. We've got a younger generation who are new pioneers for this science, like Lauren, and as we continue to grow the Glacier photo archive into the future, we're going to know that the next generation is going to harness this for their benefit. And so the photo archive is like a time capsule, and it establishes the baseline for the changes that are yet to come.
And thank you to Victoria University, Wellington and NIWA for that clip. And now, New Zealand Climate Status Presentation, which is given yearly by Chris Brandolino, the Principal Scientist of Forecasting at NIWA, the National Institute of Water and Air for New Zealand. And this pronouncement was made by him in January of 2021, looking at the last 12 months' worth of climate models. Chris Brandolino.
Let's start off roughly about a year ago, right? When things looked like this. This is New Year's Day, Lindis Pass. And this is certainly a different sky than most New Zealanders were used to seeing. Smoke from the Australian bushfires covering Lindis Pass. And just a few days later, that smoke made its way onto the North Island. In fact, many North Islanders would have experienced this foreboding sky, the orange skies. You can see the plumes of smoke, really interesting. You can see coming off the eastern part of Australia from Queensland down to New South Wales. And that's something that was a big news story early in the 2020 campaign. But even well after the smoke had dissipated, the fires were gone, the footprints remained. This is from NIWA's annual snowline survey, captured the extent of our glaciers that were stained by the event. This is Tasman Glacier in March of 2020. At the end of August, or meteorological winter, the depth of accumulated snow at Mueller Hut near Aoraki, Mount Cook, I should say, was the lowest in 10 years on record, with less than 45% average depth. Several ski areas in Canterbury struggled to operate throughout the season due to the lack of snow. This was largely the result of a couple things. So it was a lack of precipitation, a lack of rain or snow falling from the sky, in this example snow, but it was also because of warmth. New Zealand observed and experienced its warmest winter on record. I'll say it again, it was the warmest winter on record, 2020, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. As you probably know, one of the key pieces of information we articulate at NIWA's annual climate summary is our temperature. Where do we sit? What was New Zealand's temperature in terms of an anomaly? Well, we do this, as you probably know, via our 7-station series. It's been in existence since 1909. So again, well over 100 years. So in order to articulate this, stick with me, a small journey and a bit of inspiration. So, UK climate scientist Ed Hawkins, I'm sure you've seen something similar to this, the climate stripes it's called. And what we're communicating here, not temperatures in the absolute terms, but temperatures in terms of an anomaly. Again, difference from average. So you can see where the records began in 1909, that first stripe on the left. Now, 1930 was New Zealand's coldest year on record. 2016 was New Zealand's hottest or warmest year on record. What about 2020? Well, I'm here to tell you it was a very warm year. It was, in fact, New Zealand's 7th warmest year on record. 7th warmest year. Now, the temperature anomaly, 0.63 degrees. So that is 0.63 degrees above the long-term average using 1981 to 2010 as the climatology or the base. Now, what's notable about this 7th warmest year on record is this. Of the 8 warmest years on record, 6 of the 8 warmest years on record have occurred since 2013. This is consistent with climate change. So again, in summary, 2020, Aotearoa, New Zealand's 7th warmest year on record. And the warmth wasn't just around our neck of the woods, it was around globally. This is a temperature, again, anomaly map, difference from average, showing where temperatures were unusually warm or unusually cool. And as you can see in the map, a lot of red, meaning unusual warmth. 88%, in fact, of the globe experienced above average temperatures in 2020. Again, consistent with climate change.
It's interesting that this is being said by not politicians or shock jocks or indeed conservationists, but by New Zealand's own main science organisation, with great concern for the support of a tourist industry that's dependent on the survival of those, apart from other things, on the survival of the attractions of the glaciers. Anyway, that 2 years later, two years after our tour of the glaciers in 2017, Mike and I were inspired, or Mike particularly insisted on visiting a place where he'd been previously employed, I think in the auroral observation area, a remote part of Central Otago at a little town called Lauder. There's one of the most important Southern Hemisphere observation stations for atmospheric monitoring, the NIWA station at Lauder. And Mike was courteous enough to drive the two of us from Invercargill to Lauder to have a look at this. So let's take you to Lauder, and you'll see how remote it is. It's a real sheep and cattle place, and in the middle of it, this extraordinary convocation of scientists at the Lauder Atmospheric Monitoring Station, right at 45 degrees south, somewhat south of the southernmost point of Tasmania.
Only in New Zealand.
And we were interrupted by this.
Because it will be the best sheepdog that ever there was.
Where's the sheepdog? There's the sheepdog.
There's the drover's dog. 2 of them.
Is there the dog clear?
And only with the intervention of the dogs could we make our way south. Into Lauder.
And the hotel.
This is Lauder. It's not a big centre. It's a one-pub town. I think you'll see the pub in a minute. There it is. Tiny place, but most of the people living there are scientists, as you'll see in a minute when we get into the Lauder Atmospheric Monitoring Station. Now, this is where the interesting science of the trip began. It was a completely unexpected tour that we got. Mike drove there just expecting to see an old workplace and perhaps to have a quick look inside the door. So we took the turn off to the Lauder monitoring station. It's not well advertised, up this road. over the cattle
Not
grids.
much has changed. This was only dirt road.
You see the dome on the hill.
Got an observatory here.
That's the Dobson building, they called it. One of the places from which they monitor, I think, atmospheric particulate matter. And you'll see the equipment that they use for that shortly.
That wasn't over here. We're actually about 1 mile south of the 45th parallel. At 45 degrees 1 minute south here. 45th parallel was sort of on that hill over there, just there, just up.
Good sheep country, as you can see, and the fog was still in the valleys further west.
The old office building still there. That used to be the receiving station.
And this is it.
Just drop in a sailor.
A major scientific resource of which very few people are aware. This is where they actually measure climate change and the height of the ozone layer and many other characteristics of atmospheric condition.
There's kind of this like local myth that we're the stargazers up on the hill. And I mean, it's not far from the truth because we're always staring at the sun, and so that's a star. Where we are at 45 South, we get clean air, and so we're kind of like what you would see in the atmosphere if there was no people around us, which there isn't. I think Lauder it's less well known than maybe it is amongst our international colleagues. Like within NIWA, people have an idea of Lauder and kind of what goes on down there. But to the international atmospheric community, it's really well known.
Our measurements are used to validate the measurements that satellites are making, and those satellites are also going all the way around the world and seeing the same levels of greenhouse gases that we are. And these all feed into basically our understanding of climate change and what's happening to the world. You know, just in the 7 years that I've been here, I've seen the level of carbon dioxide go from something like 390 parts per million to nearly 410. So, yeah, it's an inexorable rise.
Climate change isn't going away anytime soon. We're still going to need to make these fantastic ground-based observations. We just need to make sure that we're keeping up with the measurements that we're doing to support satellite measurements. It's all about that synergy between the two. It's linking the two together. You can't have one without the other.
All of our instruments measure by looking at the sun mostly, and there's not much in the way apart from the gases that we're looking for. I mean, yeah, it is remote. There's no mobile coverage at the site. You have to walk up the hill, which works okay, but when the power's out and the network's down and then you have no signals, it's problematic. Yeah. We have good socializing, kind of pizza party at Duncan's place, that kind of stuff. There's always some banter that goes on in the tea room, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting place to work. Yeah, the rules of morning tea and afternoon tea, it's strict. You have to be there 10 on the dot and 3 p.m. on the dot. No two ways about it. We're quite a small outfit here at Lauder, so we all have to diversify and do different things.
I'd like to say there isn't a typical day, but there is. You know, it's getting in, checking that the instruments are working okay, checking that the data that they've generated in the previous few days is up to standard, up to quality.
There's fixed routines. A balloon launch is typically on a Tuesday morning.
We prepare it here, get it launched, then we test it, it's all going, hook it up to the bottom, kind of walk it over to the driveway just there, and then we release it straight up.
We do what we can to keep our measurements alive and the different time series and recognize the importance of them. It's that kind of long-term monitoring aspect of keeping people honest, and more and more gets understood as you measure. If you don't measure something, you're never going to understand it.
There's the Dobsonian Dome with Penny Smale doing some measurements. Usually these are done at night because they can shoot laser beams up into the sky. Some of these are solar irradiance monitoring devices for different frequencies, solar imaging. You'll notice that the people releasing the balloons are in a coverall get-up. That's, as I found out from Mike Bailey today, to keep them from the danger of the hydrogen that's in the balloon. They're actually earthed suits.
Proportional to the amount of ozone and that current, the micro.
This is Dan Smale, who is showing us one of their sniffers that they put up in the air on a balloon. And that's the sniffer.
Sorry, sound effects as well.
It sucks the air in, and it's telemetry, the data back, onboard kind of processing. And everything, as you know, in New Zealand is dominated by westerly winds, so this goes up and everything goes completely east, and sometimes we absorbs at different wavelengths of different gases.
And now we tour the site with Dan Smale. There are optical instruments all over that building, all coupled into computers and then internet fed into the rest of the world's scientific measuring organisations. That's, I believe, an ultraviolet irradiance device. There are several means that they use of high-power lasers pointed up vertically to find the height of the ozone layer, the state of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the amount of it, with neodymium YIG lasers and xenon chlorine laser. And if you want to, you can hold that frame as a on stop frame and have a quick read of that. I'm putting that up for that reason.
It's the green light's good for aerosols, you probably know that. And so it's just, what I like about this is actually owned by the Japanese Space Agency, and they put up some carbon dioxide monitoring satellites, and we give them data for our carbon dioxide. And this is firing up.
Is it a carbon dioxide laser? Or?
No, this is an Nd:YAG. It's a solid state Nd:YAG laser.
Aluminium
The only LiDAR I remember back in the University of Adelaide back in the late 60s was running.
So it's firing up.
This is their method of measuring carbon dioxide in the upper atmosphere.
It's firing up, but the light, we call it light, that telescope's just the light bucket, meaning, it just collects the light. We've got another one.
Pulses of light going up and then the reflected light being caught by that big Meade telescope pointing straight up.
Pulse up, they come back. Be a very short pulse.
John Todd at your postgrad school did his PhD in LiDAR back in the early 70s.
Yeah, well, they were doing a lot of work at the...
Basically, tuning on and off.
Well, if you've got good
How are they
gear,
keying the pulses?
it should just run itself, shouldn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of maintenance on instruments, but we send all the data back to the Japanese Meteorological Agency. They do all the work, and so we're just a site. But saying that, it's been operating this is like version 3, I think. Version they've had, this goes back to 93. I love this one, by the way.
And then we went up the hill to look at some of the more remote parts of the NIWA atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder. They have microwave sensing devices inside those radomes.
So it's an absolutely beautiful mount for a GPS, and what you can do is water vapor content of the atmosphere using just a GPS. In the last 5 years, massive land changes. This used to be Bill Clouston's property.
That tower there is for sniffing atmospheric gases which are analysed in the building beyond. There you see some of the surrounding hills. It's good sheep and cattle country. With this scientific monitoring station plonked right in the middle of it, far from any major civilization, dark sky, very few people in the area, except for this group of scientists.
We've got a pump that just pumps air through it. It's kind of like your Cape Grim type stuff. Yeah, it is,
That's Mike VK7MJ in the red flak jacket. And Dan Smale in his flip-flaps taking us for a tour. We didn't expect this tour, this just came about very spontaneously. Something that I'd point out is that far from being secretive, most of the people measuring climate change, atmospheric greenhouse gases and the like, are only too willing to reveal their techniques and exactly where the measurements are coming from. There's no fudge about this, there's no secrecy. Why more people don't visit the CSIRO or the New Zealand equivalent, I cannot imagine. There are a lot of people out there that are prepared to criticise anybody who might speak in support of the need for change, for climate change, but so few people bother to go and look at the source science, and this is what this is.
Semiconductors are not any of that thermophile stuff anymore. That's a photometer measuring at different wavelengths for light, and it'll just scan up and down measuring at 3 or 4 different wavelengths like the aerosol measurements.
Okay, so that's just putting a shadow across it to calibrate it.
This one here knows looking directly at the sun, or it might look up here, or it might look there, and it's just purely a radiometer with filters, a filter radiometer.
Okay.
So
So
different
that's the
wavelengths.
arm sort of shading it as well.
That one there, or that
Yeah,
one there?
No, that one over here.
Oh, that one, yeah. So you can see what these, in the old
Looking back down the hill towards the sniffer, up on that pole, with anemometers on it as well.
You don't want to be on a roof and fall off. You crap off, you've wasted $100,000, $200,000. And we do it incorrectly, we could do some abrasion and we'd actually chromatically alter it.
Or you leave a deposit on which...
This is another type of laser that emits via a Raman cell 2 different wavelengths so that they can analyse various aspects of the atmosphere above. Oh, wait a minute, no, this is the solar,
So what happens here is we've got
the solar
solar
observatory
tracker,
telescope.
Sun, and it looks at it through 2 ways. Passive, meaning it uses an algorithm based on your longitude, latitude and time. But we want to lock on, then we want to lock on to the centre of the sun, because if we look at the side of the sun, you get a small Doppler shift in the spectrum, and if we can eliminate that, it makes our processes, our analysis easier. So what we do is we splice off a bit of light that goes back into a quadrant detector, and when it's off a bit, it will move it back to the middle. So it's called active tracking.
And with this they can make very accurate measurements of solar and atmospheric spectral analysis, which is what you see on those graphs up there.
Lost arc, and we know if that moves off there, we've got something wrong with our tracking system.
Effectively, it's pinhole camera, isn't it?
Yeah. And the great thing about this is that once you've got it all aligned, your eye, if you actually work it out, like I can see it's about 1 millimetre off over, we'll say 4,000 millimetres, 4 metres. So you do the radians on that. How accurate is that with your eye?
So that's actually... Are you filming at the moment, Oh, that's...
The Solar Observing Telescope.
But here we're just sucking air in through those lines. This is the pump we saw. The pumps air in through that line we saw outside, and it gets split off into some different instrumentation.
I hope it goes along. You've got your aliens here.
This is measuring atmospheric CO2, and they can source the CO2, work out what its source is from its isotopic tag.
This tank here's got 404.52 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So when we put that through there, we can calibrate our samples, so we can get really quite high accuracy and precision in these instruments. And this is
the problem getting calibration gases, isn't it?
Yeah, luckily NIWA's up in Wellington, the NIWA Greta Point, have actually got a big lab that does all that. And so all these have, it's got a heritage.
So you don't have concentrated gases and dilution. No mixers.
So this here will have a heritage of this tank. I can actually trace the history of this back to the New Zealand standard, and the New Zealand standard can go back to the world standard. And so the idea is around the world, everyone does this around the world.
Know all about that.
Yeah, we're all on the same scale. So half my job is making sure that we're just making good measurements.
Probably 3/4 of the job is making sure it's having all your measurements traceable back. Not traceable back, well really
They test their carbon dioxide measuring against a standard carbon dioxide atmosphere in those cylinders.
I'm going to like a 2 metre part. This has got a 1 centimetre. And it can do, and we can see methane and carbon dioxide at ground level because it's such a wide broadening. It's a high pressure broadening. We can look at extracts there.
This equipment is often established and developed with the aid of agencies in other countries, Holland, Japan being prominent.
This one is you can actually do the carbon isotope, CO2 heptal-13, and and it always. This is,
Important point. Natural CO2 can be differentiated from fossil fuel burnt CO2 and measured separately by its isotopic signature. This is an interesting point, very rarely made, that came out of this tour of this facility, so that this facility can actually differentiate fossil fuel burnt CO2 from the natural CO2 out of volcanoes and indeed emitted by the soil by its isotopic signature. And they have the equipment here to separate the two and to make some decisions on what's advisable for industry. Let's go back to that video for Dan Smith.
Dioxide, and this is nighttime inversion. So at nighttime, and I know, for instance, this is when the wind was low, so we just get that coming out of the ground. Yeah. And this is the isotopic signature at nighttime, which changes from our so-called baseline right now. So we can see the different isotopic componentry. We know it's coming from the soil because it's got a different isotopic signature. And what I like is everyone say, you get your naysayers about carbon dioxide who are saying, carbon dioxide, it's going up, but it's a natural cycle. We always say to them, well, okay, tell me how come the carbon isotope's changing towards the heavier isotopes of the fossil fuel, and there's no way you can naturally reconcile that. There's absolutely no way. It's only if you can do by burning oil. Yeah. So therefore, it shows you carbon dioxide going like that, the isotopes going like that.
You're part of a conspiracy, you got to know that.
Oh, yeah.
All these climate scientists looking for the big research grant.
Yeah, well, what can you do? Especially when Einstein put out the theory of relativity, it was a conspiracy theory, a Jewish conspiracy theory. And people were marching in the street against his theory of relativity. Look, what can you do?
I remember as a boy, people say, rubbish, and then quantum mechanics, that can't exist. You can't have something in two places at once, and things either are true or they're not true.
But people are just conservative by nature, and if they don't like it, they'll just...
Having a look at the CO2 measurements.
It can't be true if they can't understand it.
Or they can't control it.
Yeah, or it impinges on their belief system. Yeah. So I heard a good quote as a person said, you can never convince a person logically if they've come to their own conclusion illogically.
That's right.
So...
Important point number 2 regarding human-induced climate change, and I'd like to repeat that quote from Dan Smale. You can never convince a person by logic if they've come to their conclusions illogically. And I want you to keep that in mind as we continue with this tour of the atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder in New Zealand.
And it splits it up into different photomultiplier tubes.
Yeah.
Right.
So and we actually, just this year, we actually put on some smaller, see those little things up there? Those are photomultiplier tubes on some little telescope just to do the near, ground level kind of, where you do this for your stratospheric. And it only operates at night time. And it can't really operate on a full moon either. Well, the signal to noise is a lot worse on a full moon.
Okay.
And this is the optical bench, and this is the laser. So this is a xenon...
infrared? That's a massive laser.
308 and 350.
Well, you wouldn't want to get an eye full of that then.
No, it'll pitch your eye. And
an ultraviolet laser.
Full of hydrogen to split the light into 2 different wavelengths, and by the pressure of the Raman cell, you can say what wavelengths you want, and we want 308 and 353. I remember it's 308 because that's an old V8 engine, and 352 was an old Ford V8 engine, I think, or 350 Chevy.
Oh, okay.
That's how I guess mine. Anyway, you send up 2 beams of light, and at one wavelength ozone absorbs and one wavelength it doesn't, so you can do a differential optical measurement, absorption spectroscopy it's called.
And what are the 3 vertical tubes?
Well, they just send the light up. This is the optical bench.
So these are the transmitters and that's the receiver?
No, they're literally just tubes.
They just transmit tubes so that...
No, there's nothing in them. They're just...
I know, but I mean there's a
light goes
there's a mirror there.
Yeah, if you look under here, you can see the collimating mirror and the 45-degree mirror and all that.
Oh, yep. So,
and then the big light bucket just catches the...
So that's firing it up here, and this is the receiver.
Yeah.
So these are the transmitters, and that's...
Correct.
Yep.
Bloody big receiver. Looks like a 16-inch mirror being used as the light bucket to receive
My dish
pulses.
is bigger than your dish.
Well, when it comes to LiDARs,
that's all right.
Is it nice? It's always nice to hold a bigger one. Yeah. Nice and smart.
And there's that massive laser, the ultraviolet laser that produces two different frequencies, as this diagram shows, and the two different frequencies are used to ascertain different characteristics of the upper atmosphere, frequently up to 30 kilometres straight up. There's a diagram of the receiver, a big reflecting mirror, parabolic mirror, concentrating the light into a very sensitive photodetector.
I work as a Lauder operator or a technical assistant, and I run the Dutch Lauder at night times on a part-time basis. We fire a high-powered laser up into the atmosphere and get its return signal via a telescope, and they use that data to calculate the stratospheric ozone. There's two different wavelengths going up and straight up into the atmosphere, and we measure the return signal, and based on those return values they can calculate the ozone. It's technical, it's interesting, it's fun, and it's doing some good work really. There's a NIWA atmospheric research station here because there is a beautiful clear sky and no light pollution and very little atmospheric pollution here. The best things about living and working here in Lauder are the views, the scenery and the isolation, which is fantastic.
And you get to fire lasers.
Yeah, I get to fire lasers. Yeah, it's great.
Important point, and this is another one that's frequently brought up by the naysayers. The important point is, and I'll give the evidence for this, volcanoes do not produce more CO2 than the burning of fossil fuels. Recently, I think in 2009, there was an article in Scientific American. This is not some ratbag rag, this is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Are volcanoes or humans harder on the atmosphere? And I'll take this quote from that article. According to the US Geological Survey, the world's volcanoes, both on land and undersea, generate about 200 million tonnes of carbon dioxide annually, while our automotive and industrial activities cause some 24 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions every year worldwide. Despite the arguments to the contrary, the facts speak for themselves. Greenhouse gas emissions from volcanoes comprise less than 1% of those generated by today's human endeavours. Less than 1%. So let's knock that idea of volcanoes being a principal source of CO2. Another indication that human emissions dwarf those of volcanoes is the fact that atmospheric CO2 levels, as measured by sampling stations around the world set up by the federally funded Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Centre, have gone up consistently year after year, regardless of whether or not there have been major volcanic eruptions in specific years. If it were true that individual volcanic eruptions dominated human emissions and were causing the rise in carbon dioxide concentrations, then these carbon dioxide records would be full of spikes, one for each eruption, says Kobe Beck, a journalist writing for online environmental news portal grist.org. Instead, he says, such records show a smooth and regular trend. No spikes.
This is the Lauder Atmospheric Research Station. Environmental Science, where we've just been on a tour with Dan Smale, one of the scientists here.
And our sincere thanks go to the NIWA people at Lauder and indeed to the University at Wellington for the usage of footage on this test transmission by VK3AML. Okay, so that gives you some idea of some of the things we got up to in New Zealand, inadvertently, walking right into the centre of atmospheric research for the Southern Hemisphere, following our observation with our own eyes of the retreat of New Zealand's glaciers, which is rather like the canary in the mine. It's the indicator. Okay, in about 3 or 4 minutes I'll open it up for the regular QSOs. I better just change my connections here, making sure I've got some sensible sort of level on the mixer for 147.475. But okay, now I'm hoping to goodness I'm not going to be abused for the contents of tonight's test transmission. I know it's a contentious issue, but please give me credit. I am going straight to the horse's mouth for the information. I have not mentioned once Bob Brown, or Alan Jones, or Andrew Bolt, or indeed any journalists, shock jocks, or politicians. Richard Flanagan, haven't mentioned any of them. This has all been directly from personal observation and the experts that are actually measuring the effect of climate change. So please, this is not a political broadcast. This is information, I would hope. So, with that being done, I'll now open up my logbook and hopefully somebody will be around for a QSO. I'll just change my monitoring so I can listen off air. And that's some central source of monitoring. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima now calling CQ on 147.475 and standing by for any calls. Do we have any listeners on 147.475, or have we, for the first time since the start of these transmissions, struck out on a Saturday night with no responses? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima standing by. Okay, looks like in that case we terminate at this stage. Thank you, people, for being on the talk back. Just looking at the text chat up there, we've had Mike Groth watching from Hobart, VK2WAY, Jared watching from, I think, somewhere in New South Wales. Pirate, I'm not quite sure who he is, saying pollution irrespective of climate change is not good for the environment. It's common sense. Climate change resulting from pollution is undeniable. The problem is political corruption. Well, I don't want to go into politics on ham radio, but having seen the statements of the scientists actually doing the measurements, I think you can draw your own conclusions on whatever basis. And thank you for the compliment on the video collection presented, Mike Groth. I thought they intercut with our material shot by ourselves, shaky though it was, quite well in explaining the finer points of what we, as less informed mortals, couldn't describe at NIWA. As for hearing Kiwi accents again, I wonder. So, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, I'll give one final call on 147.475. Have we got any listeners out there who'd like to make any comment at all on the transmission? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima listening on 147.475.
VK3 ECG. VK3 BOX, we're just keeping you on the edge of your seat, Chris.
Ah, at last, we've got some callers there. 3CG, Dave, and VK3BLX. Great. Okay, Dave, I'll take you first. And how's your week been? And I hope you weren't annoyed by the content of the transmission. I know some amateurs that would be. hopefully not listening, to VK3ECG and Group VK3AML. Thank you for saving me from ignominy.
Yes, from VK3ECG. It was lovely to see the South Island again, and very much enjoyed seeing the glaciers and the other things. I'm afraid it's been one of those interesting weeks, and not so much in terms of problems work-wise or things like that. Things are continuing as normal, but trying to get all grass cut out here and getting things ready for the summer. So I've been out with the brush cutter, and so I'm a bit tired, I have to say. I think I managed to do about half an acre's worth. We've got about 2 acres here, so there's still a lot more to go, and it's on a very steep slope. So it was quite getting a bit tired. But no, absolutely enjoyed the video, and beautifully curated, put together, and in the usual quality. But as I said, when on the trip I made to South Island a few years ago, we went around the Sound and a lot of the fjord land below Franz Josef and so on, but didn't really get right up to the glaciers and so on. I think I was too attracted by some of the wineries and the Pinot country a little bit further across, and I had limited time, so I had to get back down to Dunedin. But it was a spectacular bit of scenery around there, and it is quite telling, and I think quite sad to see the way in which the glaciers have retreated and so on. Probably inevitable, but it will be, I'm sure, a persistent and ongoing process. It's not likely to reverse, I would have thought, at least not for a long time to come. But at the moment, of course, with the La Nina issues that we've had, it's been absolutely torrential here. We've had a few trees down. The last little southern storm we had this week brought down lots of branches. My neighbour had his car dented by a large branch that fell across his parking area and causing some damage. And the worst thing about going around with a brush cutter is that you have to keep stopping all the time to remove large branches that are caught up in all the grass and things like that. Otherwise, I am tired, but feeling a little fitter. Anyway, VK3AML in the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3ECG and Group VK3AML. Yeah, well, like yourself, I did the lawns today, and a little bit of whippersnippering, but I imagine that the property we've got here in the burbs is a little smaller and a little bit easier to handle than Warrandyte. El Nino, yes, we've had some pretty wild storms, and a storm front yesterday or the day before. I was watching the storm front come in, and it was like, how could I describe it? A cloud, like a wave, very dark, all the way from the north to the south, as far as you could see. This single wave of clouds coming across, and as it did, it got so dark the streetlights came on. Very short, sharp fall of rain, and these storms that are characteristic, the present storms that we've been having, incredibly localised. I was talking on internet to a few friends that are as close as Wheelers Hill, maybe only 4 kilometres. They were getting a dry day while we were getting torrential rain. The storm cells were very small, and I don't know whether this is characteristic of El Nino, but certainly it was a bit of a worry. For your information, next week I'll be on again with another video presentation. But the 2 weeks after that, the first week I think will be Christmas, so needless to say, having entertained our family of about 20 for that day, I won't be on that evening, and I feel that probably the next night, the next week, I probably won't be on, but we'll be resuming certainly in January. I'll keep these video presentations going as often as I can, but I don't want to destroy my social life by so doing, so there'll be an occasional week, as there was last week, where I'm not on at all. So round to VK3BLX, and wondering if you got much of that, and I hope the scientific testing techniques were of interest to you. I was I'm not trying to convince people of global warming or do anything political like that, but it's always interesting to see with your own eyes the evidence of such things, and what made it the visit to Lauder really special for me was seeing the techniques used to actually make the pronouncements that the scientists have made. I didn't speak to shock jocks. I spoke to very modest people who are not used to politicising their own work. They're not used to actually having very much scrutiny at all. So that when Mike VK7MJ, who got his degree, he got his PhD actually at the University of Otago at Dunedin, walked back into that institution after having been away for something like 25, maybe 30 years. The two of us were welcomed with open arms and literally shown everything that they could show us. There was no secrecy about it. There was no closed conspiracy about it. It was all completely open. And the number of times I hear people being sceptical in needless, foolish ways, I wish they just would pull the finger out and do something like calling up the local CSIRO, Department of Atmospheric Physics, or whatever it's called at the moment. That's what it used to be called. Go down, look for yourself. See. It's not as if these places are closed to the public. It's not as if these people, these scientists particularly, are being paid more by one political party or another. I know most of the scientists at CSIRO have worked under both colours of Parliament and been paid the same. VK3BLX and group VK3AML, and how's your week been?
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. How's the week been? Oh, I can't complain. I was away for a weekend 2 weeks back, so I missed that night on the air with you guys here. And last week you didn't have a broadcast, so I filled the time in watching the one I missed, and I found that interesting too, so there you go. Yeah, I found tonight's test transmission and the accompanying video really interesting, as a matter of fact. I've been down to Franz Josef and the Fox Glaciers. We were lucky enough to take a helicopter ride up onto one of the glaciers and walked about on the ice with crampons on our boots and that sort of stuff for a couple of hours, which was absolutely fascinating, sort of skirting around these beautiful deep green-blue ponds which form up on the glacier. Our guide had a big coil of rope over his shoulder just in case somebody put their foot in the wrong spot and finished up sliding down into one of these things or into one of the sort of crevasses that are here and there. But luckily that wasn't needed. But that was a great experience. It was a beautiful day. We were lucky with the weather. It had been a bit changeable, and the day that we had the opportunity to take the helicopter flight just turned out to be one of those beautiful deep blue sky sunny days with no significant cloud. It was just fantastic. It really was. I can't remember quite how long ago. It must have been about 10 or 12 years ago, I reckon I was there. So to see how much the ice has receded in those relatively few years, it is quite, well, it's mind-boggling, it's depressing, it's frightening. Yeah, all those. Really opens your eyes. I mean, at the time they had signs sort of dotted along the the valley, showing where the end of the glacier had been at times earlier in the century. So it certainly had been creeping back, but the rate that it's receding now seems to be pretty mind-boggling. What else do I have noted down? I did find the bit about the difference, or being able to tell the difference in the source of the CO2 through the isotopic differences, very interesting. I must keep that in mind. That's well worth following up. I must read a little bit about what the isotope differences are. As far as the contribution of volcanoes to CO2, that was something I actually did know a bit about. I'd looked that up at some stage, and over dinner one night we have a regular get-together with some friends who, in that particular group, happen to, how shall I put it, they tend to be consumers of conservative media, if you like, and that's where they seem to get their scientific knowledge, such as it is. And one of them, in very knowing terms, said that, of course, you know, most of the rise in CO2 is all natural. You know, these things are cyclical, and besides, volcanoes put out much more CO2 than all our fossil fuel stuff, and, you know, why are we worried? So I took him to task and I said, well, actually, it's about 1%. The volcanoes contribute about 1% to annual CO2 emissions. And he just looked at me and told me I was flat out wrong. You know, don't be ridiculous. You know, that was what I was told. So, so to your quotation, very hard to convince anybody by logic who's come to their conclusions by non-logical means. VK3AML in the group, VK3BLX.
And a long pause produced no breakers. Yeah, what I find frustrating is not so much the illogicality of it, but the fact that the people that are so arrogantly sure of their position as a result of what they read from sponsored journalists who are prepared to put out for the biggest bidder, rather than taking the opportunity to visit and inspect the measuring places for themselves. In the case of Australia, it's the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO, and I've heard some people come out with the extraordinary statement that the Bureau of Meteorology is controlled by communists. I find the suggestion so hilarious. I wonder where these people have been politically for the last 65 years since the McCarthy trials. I don't think they've listened to much in the interim. And certainly a lot of the people that I know who are in the scientific professions in the Bureau of Meteorology in New Zealand's NIWA are far from being radicals, in spite of Dan Smales wearing thongs leading us around the facility at NIWA. I think we caught him off guard, and I remember we hadn't met him before. Mike met one of his former colleagues who sat down and had a cup of coffee with us, and he said he occasionally comes in now in retirement, this old friend of Mike's, to have a look in and see what he can do to help with the running of the place. It being so remote, it's one of the few intellectual things you can do there. And he suggested Dan, who Dan Smale apparently is one of the people that maintains particularly the opto-electronic equipment, the photoelectric and thermoelectric detectors, and is well versed in their usage and how the equipment operates, and is one of the people in charge of maintaining the equipment. I believe his wife, Dr. Penny Smale, is the so-called laser lady of Lauder, who you saw towards the end of that series of clips, and she does the actual operating of the equipment. So it's an interesting husband and wife combination. But we were delighted to be able to be taken around. It's a long drive from anywhere to get to Lauder. We had stayed the previous few nights in Invercargill, and the drive to Lauder up a very windy set of highways, which are not highways by the Australian standard, they're highways by the New Zealand standard, which is slightly smaller and slower. We actually got there in 2 days driving from Invercargill, stopping overnight at Alexandra about 2/3 of the way up to Lauder. But for all of the driving, it was a fascinating revelation as to not only how accurately things can be monitored these days, but from my point of view, being so surprised that they are so welcoming of scrutiny, even by people who know full well the importance of the technical material that they're presenting, in Mike's case particularly being a PhD, only too willing to throw the doors open and show anybody exactly how they come to their conclusions, their figures, and the degree of alarm that needs to be raised about these various issues. And with that around today, VK3 ECG, I'll get off my soapbox now, VK3AML. With a pause, Dave, just in case anybody else would like to join us.
Okay, VK3 ECG, yes. I didn't hear anybody, but sometimes I'm a bit on the edge, so hopefully if there was somebody there, come and let me know next time. Yes, yes, as I said, I'm a little bit on the edge here, so there are a couple of people I don't hear, but John's a lovely signal this evening. Good evening there. And yeah, it is really interesting, the context of belief, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to get, it's not political at all, it's really the sense in which people want to associate with groups. And of course, it is interesting because, you know, the main group of the community which probably is, you know, generally accepting of the information that they're told and either from news or from what they read from, you know, reputable sources and so on. It's like, if you know what I mean, where you go onto one of these forums on a specialist interest group or something to find out if a product is any good, for example. You might go and say, well, I'm going to buy a washing machine or a tumble dryer or something, and you go and look up the reviews. Inevitably, of course, what you get is the reviews of all the people who've had some problems. And you see perhaps 20 or 30 reviews, of which 80% might be negative and 20% might be positive. That represents, of course, probably, you know, 0.001 of the number of people who've actually bought a tumble dryer. Now, of course, there might be a lot of other people who've also had some issues, but most people who do voice their concerns on these sorts of things are people who've got an issue with the product, and therefore there's a bias, if you like, a selection bias that drives the process, and then that changes the environment of knowledge that's out there, causing a larger percentage of people who hear that. And I suppose the same thing, I mean, in my business, one of the things we are really deeply concerned about is what's called contextual bias. And so that if you are doing a very objective process of trying to do a scientific analysis and come up with conclusions, the more you're told about the circumstances of what you're of the particular case or investigation you're about trying to take, the more background you are given, the more likely you are to observe things that are consistent with the background you've been told. And this is a real issue for particularly the general forensic sciences across the board. And so now we have very complex arrangements whereby we try to minimize the amount of the circumstances, the background we're given, and we use a process called sequential unmasking, where you start off knowing very, very little, and you do all your observations and make some deductions, and then the next phase of the reveal is given to you about the circumstances and background, and then the next phase and the next phase, and you look at whether you change your opinion, and if so, you justify and explain why you've changed it. And the idea being that you then start off with at least a very empirical view before you get contaminated by the sociological background information. So it's sort of a process of sequential unmasking, and then you go through a process of review. So when you've finished all your work, then somebody else comes along and has a look at all the work you've done, but they also, in that audit process, are also subject to the same process of sequential unmasking. So you give them the material, and you give them only that part which has been your observations and measurements, and then, having done that, you give them your opinion and your working, and they've got a very direct comparison and say, well, hang on a minute, where did that come from? Because it doesn't seem to be in the material you provided, or whatever it might be. So the same process takes place. So not only do you do it at the original source analysis, but then you do it subsequently when you start doing the review. And then the final process really is one of, we often talk about constructive confrontation. So then we'll sit and perhaps work as a group and just say of what the person presenting their work, and then everyone actively challenges it. And so it's a constructive process, but it's confronting. So in other words, you absolutely challenge. And given the nature of forensic work, where you've got to be in a courtroom eventually with perhaps a barrister actually making those challenges, being subjected to that by your own peers, which is often not necessarily with the theatrical skill of the barrister, but certainly with a very much more focus on the scientific side of it, it really it sharpens up your opinions and sharpens up the way in which you approach things. So it's very much a changing field. That sort of approach has really only come to the fore in the last sort of 10 years or so. And it'd be nice to see perhaps some of those sorts of approaches being revealed, because I don't think most people know that that's the way people work these days, with a real attention to this concept of not being influenced by the masses. That said, of course, we still have people come back and say, well, we completely disagree, you're completely wrong, because I know what happened long before you even did your work, before any analysis was done. So it is really a fascinating sort of challenge. And of course we're seeing the same thing now with not so much the COVID issues, but of course issues around vaccination and the effects there and so on as well. So it's really a very fascinating sort of experience about what goes on, the way in which we all have access to so much information, and we do, and we expect to have access to lots of information, but we also seem to expect that we can just pick and choose what bits we like to hear. And that's perhaps a slightly sadder part of the whole process. Well, on that slightly depressing note, I'll put it back to you then, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
VK3CG and group VK3AML. Well, just before proceeding, in terms of the way you work through things on the coroner's side of your life, I'm going to be cheeky. Would you be the sort of person who would have been called in, or has been called in, to investigate presumably the human remains that were discovered in the high country near Dargo of the ham radio operator and his girlfriend, missing for something like 12 months, or just a little bit less than that, I think, that have, with great publicity, just been unearthed, or it is assumed have been unearthed? Or would it be sub judice and you would be able to say nothing? I'll put it back to you briefly, Dave.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously that is the area in which we work, and I'm not involved, but not directly or personally, but the team are obviously working in that area, and as been said on the news, we've got a whole range of different specialists, and some are involved with that sort of casework. So the answer is yes, any of those sort of discoveries like that around Victoria come to us, and it's the same sort of team who deal with the major disasters, and so I've been involved in a number of those over the years, and so yeah, we are the group that get involved with that work. Back to you, Chris, from VK3ECG.
Okay, I might ask you the question again in about 3 or 4 months once the whole thing's gone through DNA analysis or whatever else they have to go through to identify the human remains there. I can only presume that the speed with which the police went to that site and the speed with which they found the remains indicates that whoever they have under suspicion has revealed something, though I suppose they're keeping it all under wraps because they don't want to run the risk of prejudicing a jury and having an expensive and very obviously publicly exposed trial brought to retrial because of the prejudice of a jury or whatever. And I suppose you've heard about it, John, too. VK3BLX and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yeah, that occurred to me too when very shortly after the gentleman was apprehended, they found the remains. So what is to follow remains to be seen, I suppose we could say. We'll stay tuned. Yeah, look, something else that was mentioned too in your video there, the atmospheric analysis was the use of the satellites to measure CO2 and the correlation with the ground stations to ensure that everything is accurately calibrated, I presume. I don't think methane was mentioned, but I imagine that they monitor a range of gases, and methane would certainly be amongst them. Although they have got a few cows out there wandering about, that could complicate things. But I noticed just in the last couple of days there was mention of a researcher who's been using some relatively new satellite data that suggests that Australia's methane emissions are a lot higher than we've been fessing up to. In particular, I think he said that emissions from the Hale Creek mine up in Queensland, if all the figures that are being published are correct, it suggests that what he's measuring, Hale Creek actually is contributing 20% of Australia's entire methane emission, which, or probably, coal mining emissions, which he thought seemed rather improbable. So most likely it's actually a smaller percentage and the totals are a lot higher than people have been told. So I have to have a stern word to my daughter who works at Hale Creek. But anyway, she's not going to stop drilling holes tomorrow, I don't think. What do I have here? Oh, yeah, look, the business about it'd be nice if these skeptics went and had a chat to the CSIRO. That's the last thing they want to do. These people, they don't want to know, or they do know and they won't admit it. And that's basically, there's too many other things that will be upset, too many other apple castles will be upset if people really did take it seriously and really did start to make changes and really did have the guts to tell the public that yes, we might have to make changes, will actually cost us a bit. Find a politician who's game to say that. I don't know whether it's the politicians or the people we should blame. It's a case of they can't handle the truth, I think. But there we are. All right, back to you, Chris, VK3AML and the group, VK3BLX.
You notice I'm leaving pauses just in case. Next time I'll pause. I'll rip my squelch level right down to see if I can hear anybody down low. So if anybody distantly is listening and would like to join us, please do on the next over. The whole thing of coal mining is an interesting one. One thing that is frequently said is that we generate very little pollution compared to other countries like China, India, and USA, which directly may be the truth, but the biggest problem, as I understand it, with the carbon footprint, according to the stats that I've read, is coal. For a whole variety of reasons, not just the pollution, but the amount of CO2 generated by the burning of coal compared to any other fuel. And while our industries may not produce that much CO2 directly, the fact is that our country, Australia, is, I think it's quoted at 24% of the world's remaining untapped coal resources that are known are in Australia. So we're in this bind. Ultimately, what is mined in Australia will come back to us as CO2 greenhouse gas. Whether we burn it, whether India burns it, whether China burns it. And the question arises, should you dig stuff up and make a short-term profit while prejudicing in a major way our long-term comfortable survival with temperatures and agriculture and everything that goes with it at a manageable level? Or should we leave the coal in the ground and transition more quickly to renewables, which is almost inevitable in the long term? We may go through a period where nuclear is the stopgap generator on the way to becoming more completely renewable. One thing that amuses me always is people who use the word renewable as if it's undesirable. I mean, come on. What does the word mean? And I also find it odd that people who have children and even grandchildren don't seem to worry about the impact of all of this on their subsequent generations, who I thought they were duty-bound and nature-bound to nurture. As for which government is doing something about it, dare I say it, Jacinda Ardern. And the sort of public pronouncements being made in New Zealand about the problems, such as the director of the NIWA, whose name I've written down here somewhere, the director of forecasting at NIWA, the American chap, whose name escapes me at the moment. He was very blunt in saying that a major problem had occurred from the burning of Australia's bush with the air quality in New Zealand. So the New Zealanders certainly know what's going on with climate change. And an interesting point, the huge bushfires that we had all along the eastern coast of Australia at the start of 2020 resulted, as you saw in those clips, in the darkening of the surface of the snowfields in New Zealand, which reduced their albedo and increased their melt rate. So the things that are going on in our country don't stay in our country. So consequently, New Zealand is concerned about the way Australia goes with all of this. I think you're right in that a lot of the people who deny it all don't want to know, rather than aren't aware. And it's just a pity that people don't go to a reputable source for their information, but rather go to the populist press, which always has an advertising or finance bias from people with axes to grind, people with barrows to push. Economically, I mean. But as I say, the coal is a concern because not so much if we burn the coal ourselves, because our industry is just not big enough on international terms, but if we mine the stuff, it will come back to bite us in the bum as gas, greenhouse gas. VK3 ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML group VK3 ECG. Yes, fine. I think that's right. I mean, it's very interesting to understand what people's beliefs are about these things, and clearly, as a primary producer of, whether it's ores or coal and so on, the impact that Australia has is likely to be far greater than, as you say, the impact of actually burning it. Although there's a lot of interest these days in new sort of courses and so on in public health, and they've shifted a little bit from the days of sort of traditional public health models, and it's certainly today there's a move towards a number of postgraduate sort of studies in the areas of environmental public health, and I suppose the burning of that the coal mine and the ongoing burning for months and years. There are some coal mines that have been burning for years underground, and the impact of that on the local community, including public health issues and people's individual health in exposure to the gases from those long-term burns, is increasingly recognised, as is a number of other factors. And indeed, if you have a look at some of the issues that arise out of even just climate change and the temperatures and heat waves, whether heat waves themselves are certainly weather in a sense rather than climate, but there is a link, even though it's not a direct necessarily a direct one-to-one link on every single heat wave that happens, because there will always be those huge weather variations from time to time, but it's the underlying trend that's far more important. But there's definitely been, and will probably continue to be, major health implications from these. And again, these are things that people are really somewhat uncomfortable to talk about. It's sort of, are people going to stand up and say, well, climate change killed my grandma or my grandfather or something like that? I mean, these are issues which are quite challenging and quite confronting. And the other thing, I suppose, is that the reality of being able to do something about it yourself as an individual is so small that one feels sort of impotent in the sense of being able to achieve any real change. There was a famous anatomist, who Morgani, and who we used to have the words, actually, it's one of his great statements, written up at our workplace, and it goes on the lines of those who've actually, I'm paraphrasing it really, those who've actually had taken the trouble to have a proper look at the issue have at least learnt to doubt, whereas those who've never made any study of it at all are in no doubt at all. And I think there is something about that. If you do take a good chance to have a look at it, you say, well, there is a debate to be had here, I'm concerned, or whatever it might be, but I really think there is something going on, and I'm prepared to sort of hear and listen to the arguments. But whereas if you don't bother to make any study of something, then you can just hold whatever view you like. And that's a very sad, but I think a true aspect of the way we think about these things. I think actually the thing I did like those things, the video about not just the laser stuff, but the satellite stuff. I think it really is interesting, and I think John's right. There's a whole heap of analysis now, and I think there was something recently on the news about some of the complex use of satellite imagery in actually just looking at was it forest and forest regrowth and things like that, where you get a much better picture of what's going on than you could ever do from the ground, because there's just so many places you can't get to and do the studies in the same way from the ground. So that's one aspect of putting money into space and space research, is that in fact it does tell us a little bit what's going on at home, and that may be in fact really very important. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
Now, do we have any other breakers for the group? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I'll turn my squelch right down to see if I can hear anybody weakly. VK3AML, just briefly listening for breakers. Not a trace here. Yeah, the psychology of belief. I mean, this applies to religions as well as to scientific assumptions. I mean, there are some religions that believe that we're in the last days, inverted commas, and therefore some of them look forward to the end of the world because they believe that they'll be one of 10,000 to be saved. That probably reveals a prejudice against certain particular types of religion that I'm sure you are well aware of, but the trouble is that some of these religions are actually fatalists, and if these people, some of them are actually in control of our political systems, and that really worries me. Fundamentalist types too, not so much in this country but in America. Christian fundamentalism of a particularly nasty, self-aggrandizing prosperity gospel type have come to the fore, and their influence on the local politics is really worrying in terms of saying things like the poor deserve to stay poor. Have they ever read their Bible? I doubt it. Anyway, getting off that, this thing of going to reputable sources. Many years ago, I was interested to get a printout of the spectral transmission of the atmosphere at sea level, so that I would know what wavelength, what colour of LED I should use, or laser diode, to go through the atmosphere at a reasonable distance for communications purposes. So back about 1985, I think it was, I went to the CSIRO Division of Atmospheric Physics, which in those days was in Aspendale, and asked them about all of this because I was interested in trying DX with light, which I've since done, of course. And there are two commonly available type of infrared diodes. One of them with an output very close to the visual spectrum at 850 nanometers, and the other type with an output at 940 nanometers further into the infrared, but still detectable by a cheap silicon photodiode detector. And I wanted to know which of those transmits better through the atmosphere, and it turns out there's a major H2O absorption band very close to the 940 nanometers of one of the two diodes, which meant that if you have moist conditions in the air, the atmosphere will not transmit that infrared. Whereas the other diode, 850 nanometers, would transmit perfectly well. And so I had to get a printout of a graph of atmospheric transmission versus wavelength. And I was amazed at the resolution to which the CSIRO Atmospheric Physics could print one out for me, which they did, from a long computer program. They gave me, in those days, mid-80s, a long printout of wavelength versus transmission in figures, which I had to convert into a graph. Very tedious. But you may have noticed in the background of the Lauder pictures, they had graphs of infrared and ultraviolet transmission for the atmosphere going way out beyond the visual wavelengths. They've got very sophisticated equipment to do those spectral analyses, which immediately tells them which particular atmospheric constituents are optically in their vicinity and how much of each. And that's the sort of thing that they measure with firing their lasers up into the air, quite apart from working out with LiDAR the height and intensity of the ozone layer, with making a pulse of light which causes the ozone layer, say 20 kilometres up, to fluoresce, and then they detect the fluorescence bounced back. It's a wonderful period that we live in terms of what can be analysed both on Earth and in space, as you say. VK3BLX, I've raved long enough. VK3AML.
VK3AML on the group VK3BLX. Oh, there's plenty more time to rave, Chris. No point worrying about that. Yeah, well, where were we? The comment you made there about the certain, right-wing or religious people and the prosperity gospel types. It has occurred to me that if Jesus were to come back to Earth, if he was to look around, he would actually recognise any of his followers as the people from these sorts of groups. I think he might regard them as being having strayed a little bit from his original plan somehow. But anyway, who's to say? I know I have some fairly staunch religious in one branch of my family, and they can pretty much find a psalm somewhere in the Gospels or in the Bible to support pretty much any view on any subject. There'll be something that they can quote as backing up their views. So it's a very handy tome. It's a very flexible and useful document, the old Bible. I don't know whether I mentioned this, but I did see a cartoon not long ago which I was very much attracted to. I thought it was very funny. Old bearded God is up in heaven there, and he's surrounded by angels, and he's looking down at the earth, and he's saying, I'm starting to prefer the ones who don't believe in me. VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX.
Well, yeah, I've often been struck by the way if you lift anything in the Bible out of context, and you can lift a lot of stuff out of context, you can use it to support anything, as you say, including slavery. The wife that strays, you can bury her up to her neck in dirt and then stone her, not in the pleasant way either. Or, Deuteronomy, particularly in the Old Testament, is full of the most horrific stuff. I mean, I read 2 books of the Bible as a kid that gave me nightmares. I did read the Bible as a kid when I was, 12, 13, starting to think about such things. Deuteronomy and Revelation. Somebody should do a science fiction film based on the book of Revelation in the Bible, because the images that are therein are better than the best 2001 A Space Odyssey that I've ever seen. But, it's this thing of lifting stuff out of context is something. It's a technique that could be applied to any number of things. The climate change deniers, Lord Christopher Monckton, for example, lifts all sort of stuff out of context from scientific reports, which in fact, when you look at them, say the opposite to what he's conveying. But the point is, he cherry picks particular figures out of particular things to try and push his idea. The question is, of course, who is giving Lord Christopher Monckton his money? Follow the money trail. In the case of scientists measuring what they do. An important thing that came through to me from knowing Mike VK7MJ, who's worked in sciences most of his life, as well as meeting some of those scientists down in Lauder, they don't get a huge amount of pay, and it doesn't vary whether one government or the other is in, because most of them, if they're working for the government, are on a fixed public service level income. And it's not great, particularly not great when you think that a lot of these people have not been of earning capacity until they pass their PhD, which might have taken the first 30 years out of their life without getting much income, so that their productive lifetimes in terms of getting money would be from the age of, say, 28, 30 when they get their PhD until 65 when they retire. So, being highly educated frequently isn't the way to get a lot of money. These days, I think if a girl marries a plumber or an electrician, they're more likely to get rich fast, or a real estate agent, than marrying a scientist. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yes, from VK3ECG with a short pause. Yes, absolutely right, and it's something that we do sort of careers things occasionally for people, and you have to explain to them that yes, actually, one of the issues of learning and a lot of the professions, in fact, is you actually start earning relatively, late than most people, and also that if you are in an area, and science is not one of those areas, if you're in an area which does have potential for earning a lot more later on, then in fact the time period when you are earning a lot is really right at the end of your career. So in terms of investing, and as these financial advisors keep saying, building your wealth, you're in the worst possible position. And it is striking, even, and certainly government salaries and so on in the science area are particularly poor, and people are often surprised about that. But it's true for a lot of professions. Even professions like law and so on. When you're young and a very junior person in those areas, you don't earn a lot, and you're often expected to work long hours on the same fixed salary as somebody who's just doing a 38-hour week sort of thing, but there's an expectation that you do 60 hours a week. So it's actually quite surprising, and as you say, the entrepreneurs and the people who are able to earn money early on may well do a lot better over the lifetime and so on, which seems extraordinary, but that's the way of the world. Yes, the other nice quote when you start comparing people's views and going back to the sort of scientists again is that one of the nice things about science is that if somebody does come up with a new argument and a new point of view, and the scientists sit down and evaluate it, they'll often turn around and say, well, yep, I think you're right, and I think we were wrong, and we'll now work on the basis of, you've got a compelling argument, and we'll accept what you say, and we'll work on that, and maybe it'll change later, but that's what we'll do now. And scientists are prepared to change their mind. And that almost makes them, in some people's views, as if they are of lesser value because they are prepared to change their mind. Everything must be certain and must be concrete forever in people's minds because they like that degree of certainty, and often what science gives you is the level of uncertainty. And although we might think, well, that's really refreshing, it obviously gives people concerns, and we've seen the same with COVID, haven't we? People saying, especially with the new variant, people are saying, well, is it worse or not? And we're saying, well, actually, the real answer is we don't know, and we won't know for a while, and that's the right answer. But somehow it's deeply unsatisfying for people, and I think again, there's a lot of issues around TV shows where The magic answer is the answer that's given very, very rapidly by the magic test that couldn't possibly occur in the real world. And that tends to, I think, focus people to believe there is a single magic answer, and that if you analyse something, you will get an absolute value, and it will be that value and no more and no less. Whereas almost all analysis is about coming up with a range. But these are the truths that people are uncomfortable with and find difficult. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
One more try. Would anybody like to join us, VK3AML? No. It's a bit of a slow night. I suspect that my not having come on last week also may have given people the expectation that I'd given up for the Christmas season or something, so keeping it up on Saturday nights is probably a good idea if I possibly can, but I don't intend to prejudice my or Prue's social life by needlessly spending huge amounts of time on this. The great thing from my point of view about putting together the videos that I do for this is that I've shot over the years heaps of home video for my own amusement, and finally this YouTube live stream gives me the option, with suitable editing, of making the stuff intelligible, listenable to people other than myself. It makes it useful, a resource that I thought would not be useful otherwise. This thing of people believing in the Bible and taking things out of context, one of the most striking non-religious instances of writing in a way that can be taken any way. I don't know whether any of you chaps have read the astrology predictions that are frequently in newspapers and magazines. And if you read the way they're written, there's a technique to it. You read it, it's so obtuse that it could mean anything to anyone, under Pisces or Taurus or whatever. You look at what you're likely to come across for the next week, and the abstruse nature of what they've written is such that it could mean anything, good, bad or indifferent. So the moon's in Sagittarius, well, who cares, Another interesting thing about media, particularly in Australia, compared to New Zealand, and I've been over there now sufficient times that I've had the opportunity to compare their television, their radio and their hard copy newspapers. In this country, the Murdoch stable tends to be right-wing influenced on climate change, on mining, on a whole raft of different issues. Fascinating point. You go to New Zealand, the main Murdoch rag over there is the Auckland-based New Zealand Herald. And from what I read in the New Zealand Herald, it is completely unbiased. It's right down the middle, in the way the Sun used to be back in the 60s. And I can only reflect that that must be the result of two things. One is that New Zealanders in general take more notice of the qualification of their sources. Meteorology people and scientists are given more credibility over there. But the other thing is, of course, with New Zealand, is their mining resources are not quite as great as ours, particularly in the coal and iron ore area. And there are forces, political forces, as well as media forces, financing sections of our media to report certain things like climate change a certain way, a certain biased way that probably is not as important in New Zealand because they don't have the mining resources on that basis. Their resources, I guess, are more generally agricultural. And as for that question about which COVID is worse. It depends on how you define worse. I know that the new Omicron strain, or whatever they call it, is much more infectious than what's gone before. But it appears to be less fatal, so how you define it as worse, I just don't know. I think it goes to John. I'm not sure. I'll hand it to John 3BLX. If I've got the wrong one, you take it, Dave. VK3BLX and the group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. I think it's my turn again. Not that I've got a huge amount to add. I did pop up on the live stream there a comment. I think for the scientists and people in those sort of fields, it's the love of learning versus over the love of earning. The making the money is always a secondary consideration for people who have gone into things simply because they want to learn. They want to find the truth. They want to get paid for it. They've got to pay the mortgage too, but that's not the reason that they've gone into it. And it's not the reason they stay in it. People changing their mind. Oh yeah, that's it's pathetic, isn't it? Really, I mean, how so much of the general public seem to think that everything should be certain or can be certain. Politicians are terrified to change their mind, even when they, when the facts change. As I say, the facts change, your opinion should change. But a politician who changes his mind is accused of backflipping or flip-flopping or any one of a number of derogatory terms, just for doing what he very well should do. And that goes hand in hand with the recent criticisms that have come along with talk of, changing the laws around managing a society's response to pandemics. All this railing against all these rules made by unelected bureaucrats. Well, how many of our elected officials are expert in virology and epidemiology and so on? If we left it solely to our elected representatives to do all this sort of thing and, put them in a position where they're absolutely free to ignore the actual experts, where the hell would we be then, I wonder? So I think this business of using unelected bureaucrat as a sort of a pejorative, just crazy. Makes you throw up your hands in just disbelief. What else have I got noted down here? Oh, yeah, look, another element about people's willingness to change their minds. I know even amongst the scientific community, I think particularly in the United States, from what I read, there's been a bit of a polarisation about where the origin of COVID-19 might be, whether it was from a wet market or whether it was from an escape from the Wuhan virology research labs. And some guy has done another analysis of the available data from the early stages of the pandemic, and he makes a very convincing case from the first-hand interviews that were conducted at the time, both from patients and from the medicos involved, that it now seems much more likely that it really did originate in that wet market. And he states it all quite clearly and succinctly as how he's to come to this conclusion, and yet there are still medicos, presumably academics, who are saying, oh no, that still doesn't change anything, it still could have come from the lab, but they don't seem almost not to be willing to look at his analysis and maybe, gosh, heaven help us, change their mind. So it's not just the general public who start to form biases that they find very difficult to walk back from. The only other thing I was going to comment on when you're talking about horoscopes, Chris, sometimes I think there's a branch of academia or certainly one professional group who seem to have a lot in common with horoscope writers, and that's economists. But anyway, maybe that's just my opinion. VK3AML in the group, VK3BLX.
I got a good laugh out of that last comment. Yeah, with economists, I've always taken most of what they've said with a grain of salt. One of the delights of having the job that I had for 40 years odd was having access to newsreels, particularly those newsreels made at the start of sound film about 1929, when the Depression had just set in, and to look at the nonsense that was being said to the general public about the causes of the Depression. Nobody seemed to know exactly where it had come from, except speculation on, particularly in America, and buying stuff on tick without actually having the money to pay for it until such time as the stock concerned produced the profit. And eventually, of course, the whole thing collapsed in on itself and took the whole world with it, as a result of which my parents had a very tough world to come out into about 1930 to 33 as earning adults, young adults, or at least my parents did. But the pronouncements lately on economy have been erratic, and the results have been erratic. A lot of people predicted there'd be a collapse of the real estate market as a result of COVID. In actual fact, real estate market has done exactly the opposite. It's gone absolutely nuts. I wouldn't like to be a young person trying to buy real estate, particularly in Melbourne, Sydney, or the major capitals at the moment. Would hate to be that. Because it would almost be impossible for anybody earning an average salary. This is being said, of course, by me, whose last bits of earning were done by speculating in property, my own property, with my wife. And that made us enough, with only a couple of transactions, to have a very comfortable retirement. So I can't say I'm not guilty of capitalising on it. But we made more in property speculation than either of us had made, in my own case, in working with archival materials, in Prue's case, in being a nurse, which is a little sad, actually. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit. Yeah, Dave, if you are ever in the position of having access to information on what happened to the people whose remains have just been found at Dargo, I'm sure other people on the channel as well would be very interested to hear the process that goes on to determine these people's identity, I presume DNA based, and also with the disposition of the remains, the osteopathic evidence, making a stab at the way they died. The story I'd heard from a few ham radio people, by the way, on this particular issue, was that the ham radio operator concerned, whose campsite was found burned out, was, to quote most of the people I've heard speaking of him, not the sort of person to back down from an argument. And it could be as simple a thing as somebody going camping, having a debate with the guy over the camping space and things getting out of hand, somebody swinging something against another person's head, accidentally killing them, and then the lady in question, having been a witness, the guy who did the killing freaks out and kills her to eliminate a witness. Who knows? It could be as simple as that. VK3ECG, I'm just speculating, VK3AML.
Makes a good script anyway.
Oh, somebody will make a mini-series out of it.
From VK3CG, yes, I'm sure they will. Or at least it'll appear in one of those Indus crime shows. But as you mentioned earlier, I'm not prepared to speculate for anything for obvious reasons. But no, I mean from a general point of view, I've spoken about not the last week, but the week before. I think I did 5 media interviews actually, including Channel 9 breakfast show on in relation to the New South Wales and the missing boy. On again, not because I know anything specifically about the case as such, but just on the theoretical aspects of what is done in those situations and how the people work and what their choices are and what the processes are that they use and things like that. So always happy to talk about those things at some stage. But as I said, I'm personally not involved directly, but obviously it's something that we all do. So it's sort of just part of the normal work. But yeah, there are very, very standard procedures. These things have been well worked out over the years. There's books written on them. There's articles written on them. Modern advances, as you'd imagine, coming out all the time in these areas. And you know what's happened to some of these technologies over the years. Even with DNA technologies going back to the work in the 70s and so on, and the early 80s, and the use of those technologies and how they've enormously changed. I mean, in terms of the things that were done, 30 years ago, it's a radically different field today. I mean, the technology is intrinsically the same, but the application that's changed enormously. So, 30 years ago, whatever, needed large quantities of material to be able to analyse it. Now you need minuscule amounts of material to analyse it, and the timing used to take weeks to get results, and now you can get results, very quickly in a matter of a few hours, and it's even now then moving to new techniques which will start to give results in a matter of, minutes, getting results back in 10 minutes rather than it used to take 10 weeks. So, that is an enormous change in some of these technologies. But we could say the same things about many of the radio aspects. You just think about just how the technology's changed. The fundamental science is still the same. It's just that the way it can be applied and the way it can be used has left us with, some magnificent changes. And I suppose we see that in the way the bands were licensed for amateurs, and they were eternally given the bands that no one thought were any use. And then they became useful again, so amateurs got pushed into other bands, and so on and so forth, and they made them work, and then people realised that perhaps they are useful after all, so we'll take some of those as well. And it's probably going to go on like that. And that applies, to so many of those sorts of areas. And that's part of what makes it such fun to be involved with those things, to be quite honest. Looking at pushing the boundaries, finding the slightly improved antenna, finding the slightly improved, modulation system or whatever it is. So I think that's a really quite encouraging aspect of it. Yes, on the sort of astrology side, it's I always I think it was something on QI a little while ago. They were talking about Nostradamus, and of course it's quite fun to read some of the Nostradamus things, and it's almost worth just picking on a couple of verses and seeing how many different things in history and in recent times you can relate that particular verse to by just providing your own sort of an analysis or applying the words to a different set of meanings, and it is quite fascinating what you can do with just one of his verses or a few of them. And of course the real thing, of course, is that what he was good at, and prediction was probably not something he was good at, but what he was good at was making jam and making medical foods, and apparently his recipes, his cherry jam, is supposed to be the best ever or something like that. And but of course he gave them all kinds of health benefits that we certainly wouldn't get them today. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML and the group, VK3CG.
Jams from Nostradamus. Well, yeah, thanks for that. I'll just deviate for a moment and just say that there are 10 people currently watching on YouTube live stream. There have been more. It's been up to about 14, I think, at one stage. Among them, Jared Quinn, VK2WAY, who's listening from the Sydney CBD. And he says, I'll read out a few of the posts that he's made. He's going to be following up the research on carbon isotopes and the way they can differentiate the measurement of fossil fuel burnt carbon dioxide from naturally generated carbon dioxide by its isotopic signature. I think a lot of people will be doing that. I certainly did after I came back from that revelation at Lauder from Dan Smale. I never realised that was possible until he actually showed the equipment differentiating it. And it surprises me that in the arguments scotching all of the criticism of climate change as being a falsehood, that nobody seems to have brought up that very important point, and several other points that we heard from NIWA and their very important Southern Hemisphere atmospheric observation position. They're at 45 degrees south. They're sufficiently far away from any heavy industry that what they're getting there is kind of like a world control perspective, a well-mixed version of what the atmosphere is going through. And if the temperature is going up there due to man-made greenhouse gases, you can be sure that that is taking a world view, as it were, from that very remote spot in the South Island of New Zealand. Jared Quinn, VK2WAY, says, thanks to my very minimal space and limited view of the sky and ground floor apartment, I can't get you an RF, no hope of TX down there, of course, otherwise I'd be on the radio with you folks right now. Well, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that in the future, Jared, will be radiating this on 80 metres as well as on 2 VHF. Because I'm, as many people have heard, I've been looking at investing in an ANAN software-defined transceiver to give very good audio quality in a sideband transmission, not necessarily limited to 3 kilohertz of bandwidth either. And under those circumstances, it would be interesting to try this on an interstate basis on 80 metres as well as the current 2 metres. Jared 2WAY says, I'm glad to have a job where learning is central to it. As a creative technologist, much of my time is spent finding ways to entertain, engage and inform fans about technology, mostly around sports. He talks about the balance, and the truth is somewhere between the two extremes. Agreed. And what else we got here? I offered to read out what he's printed there on the text chat. He says, you don't need to do that, Chris, but you can. Maybe one day we'll bridge your postnet to Sydney too. It would be nice to look into other means of internet platform like Zoom for this. Something that's not hackable. Zoom, unfortunately, unlike YouTube live stream, the video and audio quality are both extremely limited in my experience, and the possibility of people hacking in is greater. The other problem with YouTube live stream is that unless you pay for it, and it's a fairly hefty price, they cut it off every hour, and we commonly run this 2 or 3 hours. It's 90 minutes for the video material I put on at the start in any case. Anyway, I'll hand it over to 3 BLX for an over. I will have to dash out of the room. I'll put you onto loudspeaker so I can hear you. How can I do this? Because I have the call of nature. After all of this coffee. VK3 BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3 BLX. Yes, well, as Chris rushes off with his knees together, what have we got to comment on here? I like the Nostradamus business there, Dave. How I assume that he either made the very best jam, or it will be the very best jam sometime in the future. Perhaps that's what we have to look forward to. We can just get the timescales right. Yeah, it is a shame that the Sydney siders and elsewhere can't get onto the talkback. I've got to organise something with IRLP or something like that, but I imagine it all gets quite complicated. Certainly as far as the video quality of this presentation of yours is concerned, Chris, you wouldn't want to move off YouTube, I don't think, because it's working so well. Yeah, I can't see Zoom being much of a proposition for your quality video stuff. So, yeah, in the meantime, the old text chat will have to do. Now, I had a question for Dave. Dave, with the issue of the magic answers, you know, the magic test that gives the magic answers, removing all doubt and so on and so forth, is it ever the case, or commonly the case, that a judge will have to instruct a jury to basically forget everything they've seen about pathology, forensic pathology on the multiple TV shows they've probably all seen? Do they have to sort of warn juries that it's probably the evidence that they're going to hear and the circumstances that they're going to hear described may vary a great deal from what the jury were expecting? VK3AML, if you're there. Otherwise, back to you, Dave, VK3BLX.
Take it, Dave. I am listening.
Oh, yeah, fine. Yes, John, it is really interesting from VK3ECG. A couple of things come up there, but you're absolutely right. One of the things, well, the job of the judge, of course, is to control the court and effectively and to particularly control the process of evidence being given, and to remind juries of a whole variety of things that they've heard and how they apply the law to what they've heard and so on. The judge doesn't make the mind up, it's the jury who makes the mind up about the guilt and so on, but the judge's role is to control the information that comes into the court. And obviously the judge wants to ensure reliability. There's actually quite a lot of interesting legal debate about that at the moment, but we won't go into that. But absolutely, and I often sort of say that, you know, 20 years ago it was a lot easier. You could just go in and say what you said, and you know, what you said, there was no other reference point apart from what you said, and you had to give your evidence base and so on, and everyone listened to it. But we now talk about what's called the CSI effect, which is basically jurors getting exposed to an awful lot of different things from TV and TV shows, and it's one of the sort of talks I give occasionally around CSI effects and its potential effects on the legal system. And because nowadays it's not just the judge, but the barristers, the prosecutors and defence will often specifically say to you that now, you know, it isn't like on TV. Can you explain what really happens rather than what people might have seen on TV? And they actually put that to you because of the significant risk that the jury may have in fact be swayed by something they saw on a recent TV show and give that more credence than what the witnesses say. So it's a really interesting issue, but I know what you mean about Zoom, and Zoom hasn't got the same quality. I mean, I spent 3 hours last night on Zoom and doing a long presentation internationally, actually, and it was really fascinating. But obviously, then I'm linked up to one of those paid accounts. I don't have the paid account, but I can link through another paid account, and that, of course, means you can go for longer than the time. But yes, you've got to be very careful. It's not too bad if you're doing, obviously still images and you're doing, sharing a slideshow or something like that. But if you want to share video, then you've got to expect there's going to be some significant deterioration in what's sent across the internet. There are other ways of doing it, but it really is an issue. And just going back to the isotopes issues, there are a whole really interesting stuff now on isotopes in terms of doing surveillance of not just the atmospheric issues, but also human issues as well. So a whole variety of isotope mixtures, so we're looking at isotopes of nitrogen and carbon and so on, are actually used now a little bit certainly in big countries like China, for example, to work out where people have come from, which goes to their identity. So if you come from one region of China, because it's such a huge population over a large area, you will have a mixture of isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and they will have local regional variations between individuals. And that is actually used as a sort of pre-screening process for identification of individuals, particularly people who've moved across the country from one area to another at a time when that sort of movement was unusual and concerning to the state. Some of these countries had huge effective migrations, people from rural areas to the cities and things like that. And they can actually work out where they originally came from, where they grew up, just by these isotope mixtures. It's really quite a fascinating area. Anyway, back to you, Chris, VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
Certainly puts another accent on, genealogy and the study of where you came from and whatnot. I know that those programs, Who Do You Think You Are? They do a swab of the mouth or something and send it away for DNA analysis, and then they can work out which parts of the world racially you were derived from. Though in Australia we have such a mixed society, multicultural Australia, all intermarrying more than ever before, that it will become, I think, increasingly difficult to trace people's particular racial or genealogical origins. Even in my family, Prue's DNA is predominantly from England and from Finland. Most of her family is from originally the Finnish origins, although the last Finn that was the progenitor of her family came out sometime in the 1870s, I think. In my case, mostly Irish. I'm slightly ashamed to say. It means I've got, it probably means I've got a good sense of humour but a thick head. And most of my people left Ireland in the late 1840s and 50s, something to do with potatoes. It's probably one of the reasons that there are not many types of potatoes I find palatable. My forebears probably got out of Ireland to avoid the bloody things. But I know, for example, that I have one antecedent who was Jewish, and I suspect Ashkenazi Jew, so that's 4 generations back, and I'd be interested to know which part of the world they came from and how. In a subsequent week, this is getting right off the subject, but maybe of interest to people, one of the things that we were handed down in the family were many packets, and I'll hold them up, of photographic negatives that came from a very talented member of Prue's family, and I didn't know how old they were until I started to make prints off these. They're photographic negatives in an 11 centimetre by 7 centimetre format. I've determined that they were made by a type of smallish camera called an autographic Kodak. They were made towards the end of the First World War into the 1920s. And most of these 200 or 300 negatives were taken by a teenage girl, my Prudy's great aunt, I think, in an outback town in the York Peninsula in South Australia called Edithburgh. If you look at the map, there's the Gulf of St Vincent. Adelaide is on the right of the Gulf of St Vincent, and right down the bottom of the peninsula on the left is Edithburgh. And this girl was the daughter of the lady who had the local tea shop, so they were well in socially with the rest of the inhabitants. Their name was her name was Joyce Aldenhoven, Prussian background. But she was an immensely talented young girl. Most of these negatives were made when she was about 17. She was born in 1911, so these date from the late 20s. And she went around the town documenting the lives of most people who apparently she was friendly with. They're all smiling. But it's done in such a way that the negatives are so deeply personal that it brings the whole period to life again. And a lot of the people in Edithburgh spoke German. The German influence in South Australia was much greater than that of any other state. I think the Barossa Valley's wine regions were originally established largely by the German community, who were derived from people who had wineries in the Rhine area of Germany. So it strikes me that if I reproduce these nicely, they'd make a rather nice slideshow and a descriptive historical presentation for a future Saturday night. For a long time I couldn't work out how to scan these damn things. 11 by 7 centimetres means they won't even fit into a 2 1/4 square scanner, negative scanner. And then it suddenly hit me. I use a light box. I put the negative on the light box and I arrange my camera with the macro lens on it above it, and I take a photograph off the negative and then reverse it to positive in Photoshop. And by doing that, I have, because it's a diffuse light source behind the neg, it smooths out all of the scratches in the negs. So what I've ended up with from the late 20s are magnificent grayscale pictures, not achievable by reproducing from the prints from that period, of this girl's life in the 1920s. The horses, the way all of the transport in and out of Edithburgh was via ship. Edithburgh in those days was an important port for gypsum, which was mined on the York Peninsula, as well as coal and a few other things. Wheat was also grown there, and cattle. But anyway, that's about a quarter of a major resource. There are about 100 negatives there. There are about something like 250, 300 in the whole collection. But as I'm reproducing them slowly, it's, I think, a fascinating historical resource that's worthy of presentation via this medium down the track. It's it's just past 12:30, so perhaps now we should start winding up. I noted that you said that you were tired when we started, Dave. It's very remiss of me not to have listened a bit harder and taken the gypsy's warning. I hope I haven't worn out my welcome with you by so doing. I'll hand it round first to John, VK3BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yes, I think it's about time I headed off to bed too. 12:30 is late enough. Got a few things to do in the morning, so I don't think I'll hold it too much longer. Thanks for the rundown on the court processes there, Dave. It's sort of what I expected in a way. Everybody who's a fan of CSI probably thinks they're a forensic expert these days, so it'll be a bit of a problem. All right, well, thanks again, Dave. Chris, sorry for running the show tonight. It's almost invariably fascinating. So keep that video, what would you call that archive you've got there? Keep rolling it out. It's a great resource and quite fascinating. So good evening and till next week, Dave. See you all then. VK3AML and the group VK3BLX.
Thanks very much for being there, John. And I should mention the teenage girl who shot these eventually went to Adelaide as a university student in the late 1930s and became one of the nation's first female biochemists. He was a PhD in biochemistry. And so this is the product of a quite brilliant female mind. She's very pretty too, as you'll see when the photos are printed, as it were, electronically. But I'll make a point of trying to throw that together into some sort of a historical presentation. It's a fascinating... films are usually, even documentary films of that period, are shot very formally, showing you industries, for example, in a very informal, in a very impersonal way. Those negatives taken by a teenager on her own equipment and apparently developed by herself, processed by herself on, in a developing tank, are very personal documents, and they bring the whole era to life. You'll know what I mean when you see them, but obviously she was quite a brain, and the subjects, the moments that she captures, and the impeccable framing and composition of the shots indicates to me that she knew exactly what she was doing in terms of recording her surroundings. And I can well understand why, when she eventually died of cancer in 1973 in her 60s, she made sure that the family preserved these, because perhaps further down the track she thought somebody would actually start printing them up and recreate a little of her childhood, youth. Okay, around to Dave for final, and then we'll wrap it with your kind permission and attention. VK3 ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group VK3 ECG. Yes, fine there, Chris, and yes, John, it is interesting, the sort of CSI effect and its effects on people. But I've actually very much enjoyed, Chris, looking at some of those photographs that you popped up on Facebook. I particularly like the two teenagers gossiping on the pier or the waterfront there. A very interesting sort of shot with sort of a mixture of formality but also incredible sort of casual sort of chance, acquaintance, and as you commented about gossiping, absolutely beautiful pictures. And a lot of life and vibrancy even in those sort of still pictures, which it's sort of those sort of still, more static type images, but they have a sort of vibrancy about them, which I think is very, very impressive. I did like you putting the book up on the screen there as well, and showing its Ilford film, which was Ilford was the place I was born, and yes, also I think the factory moved eventually, but it was all based originally in Ilford in northeast London, and so yes, it was a major area, but of course so many of those things have now disappeared. But absolutely fascinating. And just on the last touch there on the genealogy and so on, and yeah, absolutely the working out where people are from trends, and of course it makes a bit of a lie of all these ideas of sort of racial purity issues, because when you look at these mixtures now, everyone's a very complex and interwoven mixture of groups from all over the place. But it's a really fascinating issue, not just the nuclear DNA, but all the mitochondrial DNAs as well, which are always from the maternal line, so you can follow the maternal lines through. And of course today, quite controversially, the genealogy techniques are now being used a bit in the forensic field, because you can start making these more remote relationship linkages. So if a cousin of an individual who's left a DNA trace at a scene happens to have their DNA on a genealogy site, they can be quite a remote relative, but it might be able to be used to be trailed back through the particular family to potentially find an offender, and that's become quite a controversial area. And there's been a couple of famous cases where that's actually happened, and being able to trace people back through remote, distant relatives, and then do the sort of family genealogy in the traditional way, from the DNA from a relative that's been put on one of these genealogy databases, where they've had their own genetic mix calculated and evaluated in terms of where they came from. So it's certainly a fascinating area. But I'm getting a bit tired now, and with all the gardening work, so I'll call it a day or a morning, and thank everyone for a great chat, and thank you very much, Chris, for the wonderful video. Great to see the South Island again, and it just fills me with a desire to get back to the South Island from New Zealand as soon as I can. I think that's going to be one of the first trips I make once we really get sort of the lockdowns and things international travel starts going back to normal again. So all the best, everyone. All the best to you, John, and the people who've been on the internet as well, on the YouTube, and so Jared and so on who've been commenting. Great to read your comments as well. 72s, everyone, and I'll put it back here to you, Chris, for a final, and we hope to catch up again. I've got a couple of things obviously appearing on Saturday night, so I may not be around every single time, but I'll try and keep my ear to the ground, as it were. All the best from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Quick comment, Chris?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just talking about those photographs that young woman took reminded me of a film which I'm just wondering whether you'd seen, called Finding Vivian Maier, about the photographs that were uncovered, I think, in an auction house or something, by a guy who then managed to find basically her whole collection. She was an amateur photographer, I think, in New York, and he spent a lot of time and probably a fair bit of money arranging to have all her stuff digitised. I guess he printed some of it and then digitised it, because all the negatives had been kept. That was the key to it all. And I think, well, I saw a movie that was made of the whole thing, so it contained a lot of the shots she'd taken, and she was a very realistic, street photographer, if you like. So it was all the pictures of the daily goings on in the city from all sorts of different perspectives. She'd use a twin lens reflex at waist level, so that most of the people didn't necessarily, they weren't sort of looking straight at the camera necessarily, they were looking at her, or weren't looking at her at all because they weren't conscious of the camera pointing at them. So a lot of fairly candid, very natural photographs. Quite an interesting story it was. Anyway, I don't know whether you come across it or not, but if you do, Finding Vivian Maier it's called, and it's very interesting. VK3AML, VK3BLS.
I've certainly read about it, John, and I saw some photographs reproduced on a net source, but I haven't seen the film. In fact, I wasn't aware of the film. I must have a look. But this is a kind of a similar story. She's family, the lady that did these South Australian things. She was, as I say, a grand aunt of Peru. In fact, after taking these photographs in 1927, 28, 29, in the 40s she bought an 8mm, standard 8mm camera, and as a consequence of that and her interest in our family, we have films of my wife's christening in 1954 and of her playing with her dollies at about the age of 4 in 1958. Some in beautiful Kodachrome colour. One thing I have done is to get in touch with the local historical society in Edithburgh where these photographs, the early ones, were taken, and I sent them some scans, and I must say they've gone absolutely cock-a-hoop over it, because apparently it was a period in their history that was very poorly recorded photographically, and this young girl was just about the only person in the town taking photographs, so it fills a significant historical gap in a town that was an important port for several mining and other industries that almost no longer exist. Edithburgh now is largely a retirement place for people from Adelaide to downsize to after they leave their working lives. So it's a quiet place now, but in the 20s it was a very active place industrially. Anyway, with that, I'll start to wind down with a few acknowledgements. First of all, to Dan Smale and the very kind people from NIWA at Lauder that showed us through their atmospheric monitoring station so graciously in 2019 when we shot that video on spec. I would have liked to have shot a lot more, but we were not expecting to record so much. To the Victoria University of Wellington for the time-lapse photographs of the Fox and Franz Josef Glacier, which shows dramatically, alarmingly almost, the retreat of those glaciers over only a very short period. Also, I'd like to thank Mike Bailey, ZL4OM, young friend of mine, well, relatively young, early 30s I think, recently married his wife Rachel. Rachel is one of the people in charge of the community radio station in Invercargill. Mike is in charge of balloon launches, weather balloon launches tied in with Lauder from Invercargill, and gave me some vital information today as to why the people launching weather balloons are so heavily suited up. Turns out that their anti-static raincoats cover the head as well, so that the hydrogen in the weather balloon, which can acquire quite a static charge while it's filling the balloon, if there are any odd sparks, that raincoat arrangement that makes them look like Darth Vader protects them from the hydrogen fireball that might ensue. So there is a safety reason for them wearing that seemingly outlandish outfit. But thank you, Mike, as always. I know that you'll be watching this on replay, if not direct. Your friendship over the Tasman, and particularly in Invercargill, which is a fascinating place with some very nice people in it. Thank you for staying in touch after our meeting in Invercargill back in 2019. So, with that, I'll have a final listen on 147.475 before closing, and we'll shortly, I think, close. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, just listening.
Yeah, Chris, we're the guys in the orange raincoats. No one wants to look like the Hindenburg either before or after ignition.
No, I'm sure they feel the same. I had to actually ask Mike by internet today, why the hell are they wearing all that get-up? And he said, well, nobody can afford to run helium in those balloons, so it's all hydrogen. But that's the reason. Okay, sounds like that's the end of transmission. VK3AML now closing on 147.475, and I'll shortly be closing on YouTube live stream, which seems to have gone without a hitch tonight. We'll catch you next Saturday night, 9 p.m, for another presentation and hopefully another discussion afterwards. So this is VK3AML closing for the 4th of December 2021. It's now the 5th. Cheers, people.
Cheers, Chris.
Good night.
Okay, and on the live stream, again, thank you to the people at NIWA. I hope I didn't needlessly aggravate copyright by using some of your publicity videos. I know that the people at NIWA, although it's a very important worldwide scientific observation and measurement site for our atmosphere, get far less public canvas than they deserve, in my opinion. So I felt that it was necessary and cogent to throw together not only our video of NIWA's activities, but some of NIWA's own, so that we could hear in the scientists' own voices their rationale, their methods. So with that, I'll just check my text chat here. Jared, thank you very much for being there. Sorry we can't get you in via radio, VK2WAY that is, but and Mike 3ADD. But I'll try to work out some way of getting two computers going here so that I can live stream on YouTube but run some sort of an internet chat in parallel. It may be that that is impossible because it's all running off one modem, but if there is a way to do it, I'm sure we'll find it. Thanks, people, and I wish you all the best for the coming week. All the best from